Okay, if you're on Zoom, we're actually gonna get rolling now. And if you're in earshot, why don't you join us? Omar, you can sit in the front row. Oh, you're too close. You can switch back. You're not gonna hit anybody's knees back here, so. The day will definitely get very full as we roll. Bill, join us in the front. Oh, your materials. Okay, so we're going to get rolling on the second day of architecture thesis reviews. We'll have the jury introduce themselves. One jury person will probably come in the middle of your presentation. They're running a little behind, so we'll have her introduce herself later on, but we'll just start here at the end.
Good morning. I've met everyone here. My name is Omar Hakim. I am an architect here in DC.
Short and sweet. Ali Fard. I'm an assistant professor at UVA. And my background is in architecture, but I teach between urban planning and architecture at the moment, mainly studio, some thesis. So we'll see.
Good morning. I see some familiar faces from yesterday. My name is Bill Bonster. I'm an 83 grad from Maryland, BARC. I have a 35 person firm in DC. We do a lot of multifamily housing and a lot of other things, and happy to have remained involved here at Maryland through Board of Visitors and Alumni Association and all that good stuff. So thanks for having me today.
Okay, great. So we'll start here and then we'll just keep rotating between these sides throughout the day. And with that, I'll hand it over to Andrew.
All right, thank you. Apologize for the delay, but good morning, everybody. My name is Andrew DeGroff, and I would like to thank you for joining me on my thesis journey. This morning, I will be discussing my thesis proposal entitled Climate House. Oh. So here's a brief rundown of topics that will be covered in this thesis. First, I will discuss my thesis statement and thesis narrative, followed by some site background and context, and moving into my design analysis, development proposal, and my development objectives, and wrapping up with a brief conclusion. This thesis intends to demonstrate the architectural design process using bioclimatic design principles to create a design solution that provides a livable and comfortable environment. Climate change has become a major threat to urban areas and has challenged the way architectural designers construct the built environment. Utilizing local climate and site conditions will create a design solution that provides a healthy and comfortable environment while reducing climate change in urban areas and encouraging community engagement. To understand climate change, it is first important to understand climate. Climate is described as the long-term weather pattern of an area, typically over a period of 30 years. Climate is not to be confused with weather, which can change from day to day or even hour to hour. Climate reflects a region's temperature, wind, and precipitation patterns throughout a given year. The world features many climate zones, as seen by this map created by German scientist Vladimir Köppen in 1936, which each have their advantages and disadvantages. The Köppen-Geiger climate classification was established to measure and map the different climatic conditions and zones around the world. The five main climate zones are tropical, dry, continental, temperate, and polar. For example, some areas as seen in dark blue are hot and rainy almost every day, residing in the tropical climate, whereas areas in the dark gray rarely get above 50 degrees and resides in the polar region. However, these climate classifications have drastically changed over the past 200 years. As humans have developed and improved their technologies, they have greatly affected the climate and their environmental surroundings. Areas that were once lavished with forests and wildlife have been destroyed in a process called deforestation to make room for architectural development. Unsustainable building practices have also been employed since the rise of skyscrapers, in which concrete, glass, and steel are the primary building material for high-rise development. These techniques have attributed to several climatic conditions such as global warming and greenhouse gas effect. Climate change causes stronger storms to develop and has caused billions of dollars in damage countrywide in just the last 10 years. Climate change is a result of 4 human-based components. Most electricity is still generated by burning coal, oil, or gas, which produces carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide, powerful greenhouse gases that blanket the earth and trap the sun's heat. Manufacturing and industry also produce emissions, mostly from burning fossil fuels to produce energy for making things like cement, iron, steel, and electronics, plastics, clothes, and other goods. Finally, human waste and pollution threaten ecosystems and trap the harmful greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The causes of climate change have led to many severe and concerning challenges. As greenhouse gas concentrations rise, so does the global surface temperature. Destructive storms have become more intense and more frequent in many regions. As temperatures rise, more moisture evaporates, which causes extreme rainfall and flooding, causing more destructive storms. Climate change poses risks to the survival of species on land and in the ocean. These risks increase as temperatures climb. Exuberated by climate change, the world is losing species at a rate of 1,000 times greater than at any other time in recorded human history. Finally, climate change is the single biggest health threat facing humanity. Climate impacts are already harming health through air pollution, disease, extreme weather events, forest displacement, pressures on mental health, and increased hunger and poor nutrition in places where people cannot grow or find sufficient food. As climate change continues to threaten many ecosystems, something must be done. Bioclimatic design is a design process that considers climate and environmental conditions when designing for optimum comfort for users with minimum outside energy use, reducing buildings' environmental footprint. Utilizing mostly passive strategies, energy modeling, and psychometric charts can determine which passive design strategy should be utilized depending on precipitation, wind patterns, and median solar days throughout the year in each climate by finding the preferred comfort zone, which you can kind of see the kind of chart here. Bioclimatic architecture refers to the design of buildings and spaces based on local climate. It takes into account the environmental conditions to enhance thermal and visual comfort inside a building. This type of architecture seeks perfect cohesion between design and natural elements such as sun, wind, rain, and vegetation, making use of solar energy, natural ventilation, and other environmental sources for heating, cooling, and lighting the buildings, thus an optimization of resources and minimizing artificial energy. 3 precedents were closely examined during this thesis for their bioclimatic systems, including 2 residential projects and 1 community center. The Northeast Scarborough Community Center, designed by Perkins and Will, reimagines a community center on a restricted lot, stacking the program and utilizing materials that save on energy costs. Urban Sequoia is a skyscraper proposed by SOM in New York City that attempts to sequester carbon from the air via tree-filled sky lounges. And finally, Brock Commons Tallwood House is the tallest hybrid mass timber concrete structure in the world and utilizes a modular unit layout based on standard CLT panel sizes, which is a great source of carbon storage. As the world turns away from burning fossil fuels and nuclear energy, focusing more on sustainable construction, many of the industrial sites mentioned before remain vacant and underutilized. Many of these sites are located in major cities along waterfronts and provide desirable location for redevelopment. There was an estimated 500,000 to 1 million abandoned industrial sites just in the United States alone. Rezoning residential and commercial development in urban areas, which increases economic value and spending. On the shores of the East River in New York City, many abandoned industrial sites have already been remediated and rezoned to commercial and residential uses. This has been prevalently seen along the Long Island City waterfront in Queens, New York, where many high-rise residential projects and open park spaces have been planned on the nearly 3,000 vacant and industrial sites reclaimed by the Mayor's Office of Sustainability. The Long Island City waterfront stretches 3 miles along the southwestern border of Queens, New York, along the East River. With excellent views to Manhattan, Roosevelt Island, and Brooklyn, this area has proven to be a valuable and desirable location for residential and commercial redevelopment. There are many methods of transportation from Queens to Manhattan, including the Queensboro Bridge and ferry terminals that run along the East River. The history of the waterfront begins with the urbanization of Manhattan. In the late 1790s, many factories and shipyards were constructed along the East River in Brooklyn and Queens to make way for the urbanization of Manhattan. These areas remained a thriving industrial area well through the American Civil War and up into the 1920s, when the Queensboro Bridge was constructed, connecting the neighborhood of Long Island City to Manhattan. In the mid-1980s, many of these factories became abandoned and underutilized as demand for certain products shifted. In 2001, in an attempt to revitalize the area, the Long Island City Master Plan was established, changing the function of the area was changed from industrial to mixed-use residential and commercial. Since the adoption of the Long Island City Master Plan, there have been a dramatic shift in economic status of Long Island City. The 2001 proposed master plan of the Long Island City waterfront comprises a mixture of various private and public facilities, including parks, community facilities, schools, residential and office buildings, as well as green streets. Numerous Class A residential properties, public facilities, and outdoor parks have already been planned that have established over 6,000 new units, over 100,000 square feet of retail space, and hundreds of acres of community outdoor amenity space and parks. Although there are many new developments along the East River, many lots remain vacant, underutilized, and polluted. This thesis will examine a site along the East River on an abandoned terracotta factory lot immediately south of the Queensboro Bridge. Formerly the home of the New York Terracotta Factory, the factory produced terracotta for such buildings as the Asnonia and Plaza Hotels, as well as Carnegie Hall. The site currently occupies 4 lots for a total of 2.8 acres, has a land value of $14 million, and has a flexible and expansive zoning designation that allows for mixed-use development to encourage waterfront development. This zoning allows for an FAR of 10 and includes residential along with commercial designations along almost 3 acres of waterfront property. The site currently sits vacant and has heavy pollution from a local steel refinery to the south. The front office building from the original terracotta works remains and was listed as a Landmark Preservation Commission LP 1304 in August of 1982. Repair to the waterfront has been prepped for the arrival of a 2-mile-long promenade that will stretch from Rainey Park to the north to Hunters Point South developments to the south, while the waterfront side of the site remains damaged. The site proves a valuable spot for redevelopment because of its views to Manhattan, Roosevelt Island, and Brooklyn, as well as access to many public amenities and parks. Public transportation is also high in the area, as a majority of Long Island City residents use public transportation, with only 14% of residents owning a vehicle. The site sits within 1/2 mile of 3 subway stations, 6 bus stops, and a new proposed ferry route. This site also ranks 83 out of 100 for walking and 80 out of 100 for biking. Directly adjacent to the proposed site under the Queensboro Bridge is the 20-acre Queensbridge Park. This park serves as a recreational outdoor space for the residents of Long Island City and the Queensbridge houses. A revamp to the park, including Baby Queensbridge Park, is set to be complete in 2026 and will reactivate the area under the Queensboro Bridge and bring beautification to the waterfront, allowing for numerous activities and a new farmers market. Now moving into the design analysis and design process. The beginning of this design thesis started with the climatic analysis of the site. Situated in New York City, this site resides in a humid climate zone, which is characterized by hot and humid summers with cold to mild winters. During the winter months, prevailing winds come from the north, while the summer months, the wind comes from the south. Sun floods the site throughout the year and has no shading from neighboring buildings. The site also sits 8 feet above sea level, which is 4 feet higher than the proposed seawater rise of 6 feet by 2,200. Utilizing the psychometric chart for human comfort for the New York region, 4 design principles were selected to test during this thesis. These included creating the right size and correctly oriented floor plan, creating a long, narrow residential tower, utilizing cross ventilation through building for cooling, and utilizing solar gain by window layout and shading techniques. Utilizing an energy modeling software known as Sapphira, basic energy modeling was performed on 3 different massing strategies to determine which massing would yield the lowest EUI, carbon emissions output and energy costs for a 50-year period. With an average square footage of 400,000 square feet, a tower with a bridge connected community center, a residential tower with a podium, and a stacked tower podium were all considered. Ultimately, the massing that yielded the lowest EUI was the thin residential tower and stacked community center with an EUI of 73, which will be the massing tested for this thesis. So looking at the proposal, I began looking at the site conditions with the existing terracotta front office building sitting on a lot size of 210 by 510 feet, encompassing 2.8 acres. The proposed program was then massed on the existing site towards the waterfront side, in which several waterfront amenities could be established. The site was then split into two distinct masses, breaking the site up to allow for easy access to the East River and the Queens River Walk. This would then create a pedestrian street along the masses and create a portal to the neighborhood. The proportions of the two towers were then altered to allow for solar capture on the roofs as well as ventilation through the space. Finally, to aid with noise and visual pollution from the Queensboro Bridge, the MEP and circulation core were placed along the north of the residential tower, and a bridge was established connecting the residential tower to the community building. Following all the analysis, I propose Climate House, a mixed-use, mixed-income waterfront development along the East River with both residential and commercial designations. Part of the Long Island City Master Plan is the redevelopment of an area known as Queensboro Plaza, a 20-acre redevelopment that will propose 6,000 new units and many other community amenity spaces. The goal is to connect the northern Rainy Park to the Hunters Point South development in a 2.5-mile long waterfront promenade. Situated on a former Terracotta Works lot, the site is split into two masses. Splitting the proposal into two buildings creates a unique pedestrian experience that brings the site down to the human scale in a large metropolitan city. The program separates the public amenities on the site with more private housing and home office settings. The proposal is situated on the East River, offering views of Manhattan and Roosevelt Island, increasing visual stimulation for the area. In an attempt to reconnect the neighborhood of Long Island City with the East River waterfront, this thesis proposes a central pedestrian street that cuts through the site. This pedestrian street will offer views to Manhattan skyline and encourage wandering to the river's edge in a new proposed ferry dock. Along the cut-through street will be several retail and commercial establishments where residents and visitors of Long Island City can do their daily casual shopping. The ground floor of the community center is angled to allow greater views to New York City, specifically the Billionaires Row complex on 57th Street. The residential component of this thesis consists of 125 apartments with unit mixes of studio, 1, 2, and 3 bedrooms. At ground level will be commercial retail along with a double height residential lobby. The next 2 floors consist of hybrid office space and conference space for tenants and community residents, as well as a residential lounge exclusively for residential use only. This space will include pool tables, a game room, event space for numerous events, and a teaching kitchen where local eateries provide hands-on cooking demonstrations. Four different apartment types comprise of the residential portion of this thesis, including studio, 1, 2, and 3 bedrooms. These unit types are spread throughout the tower and are surrounded by numerous green sky gardens and community rooms for residents and small groups. The units range in size from between 392 and 1,232 square feet. This residential mix encourages occupancy from a single person starting life in a new city to a large 4-person family, encouraging a mix of race, wealth, and family size. The second component of this thesis is a community center that will serve the residents of the Climate House development as well as local residents of Long Island City, while the residential units are being built out, bringing people to the site. The community center is small in size, with many of its programs stacked and utilizing vertical circulation experience, which cuts down on energy costs. The community center also features built-in terracotta spandrels that act as solar facades to capture sunlight to transfer into energy that can be opened and closed, allowing views, shading, and ventilation. The community center will feature a wellness center for individual and group use and includes a lap pool, basketball court for numerous court sports, weight and cardio room and track, as well as a small daycare center for Climate House residents. Connecting the residential tower to the community center is a bridge that gives tremendous views of the pedestrian street and Manhattan from a heightened view. The ground floor features a restaurant as well as an exhibition center with numerous bioclimatic displays on exhibit for the community to learn more about sustainable building practices while waiting for the ferry. Throughout this thesis, 4 main objectives were considered to create a climate and net zero positive building. These 4 design principles include solar orientation, daylighting in units, natural ventilation, and carbon sequestration and storage. The first bioclimatic design principle utilized in this thesis was solar orientation. To maximize natural daylighting in units, the project was oriented on the site to receive the greatest number of sunshine hours. Additionally, 576 solar panels are placed along the community building green roof. This results in electric consumption of 394,617 kilowatt hours per year. These panels will be on a tilting mechanism which will angle throughout the year with the sun angles, maximizing solar energy for the site. Units were designed to take full advantage of daylight, solar gain, and summer prevailing breezes from the south. For that purpose, triple E pane smart windows were installed in order to automatically tint to allow the right amount of light into the units, almost eliminating the need for artificial light during the day. Public spaces are lit well via sun shading windows, while more private spaces are placed along the circulation core. During summer, windows adjust to block unwanted solar gain, while in the winter, solar gain is passed through the window. Another very popular climate change mitigation strategy is the use of natural ventilation. Natural ventilation occurs when wind passes through one opening through a room and out another opening on the other side of the room. Operable windows within each apartment, which are single loaded, offer the occupants ample flow through natural ventilation and daylight, with the unit door having a vent which can be opened, controlling airflow. The air then enters the hallway and leaves through the openings on the north side of the corridor facade. Winds from the south provide cool breezes through units and community spaces during the summer months, while harsh winds from the north are blocked by the single loaded corridor MEP and circulation cords when the corridor windows can be shut. Finally, carbon sequestration, when acting as a carbon sink, helps to mitigate climate change and thus reduce harmful effects of climate change. In order to absorb carbon in the air, numerous green roofs and sky gardens are placed along the facade to capture the carbon and pollution given from the Queensboro Bridge. Smaller terrace balconies are also utilized along the facade. These green roofs also assist with rainwater control and sediment runoff control and provide small outdoor spaces for residents of the community. The utilization of mass timber products also assists with carbon storage and stores over 3.5 tons of carbon monoxide a year. Finally, putting all 4 of these development objectives together in a 3-floor axon shows the meticulous detail and thought in which all these systems interact with each other to provide a comfortable environment for residents while minimizing the carbon footprint of the building. Finally, discussing the sustainable construction techniques. The building materials for this thesis comprise of concrete for the central circulation cores, cross-laminated timber floor plates and walls, and glue-lam columns comprise the main structural component of the tower, with fiber cement siding on the exterior. The community center building will comprise of a post and beam structural system with glue-lam columns and beams with a terracotta cladding finish, reminiscent of the site's previous history of being a terracotta factory. Geothermal heating and cooling, as well as rainwater collection to reharvest for gray water, also minimizes the energy use of the building. The structural system of this thesis will be hybrid concrete and mass timber construction, almost mirroring the structural system of Brock Commons as seen here. Utilizing mass timber will also speed up the construction cost. From an environmental standpoint, this development uses mass timber because the material is renewable and also because of the increased air quality it provides. Mass timber can also be fabricated off-site and provide strength similar to concrete. The timber from this development will sequester carbon emissions from the air, thus removing pollutants that can be harmful to human health. This thesis utilizes a modular residential system that consists of units ranging between 1 and 3 modules. Creating a horizontal Tetris pattern along the facade, these units are designed based off a standard CLT sheet of 14 feet by 28 feet and are designed to give a unique experience to each individual occupant and to allow each individual floor plan to be unique as well. Sky gardens are fitted along the facade between the units, creating an interesting facade expression of fiber cement and vegetation, similar to that of the urban sequoia. The concrete podium serves as the main structural base component of the residential tower, with the mass timber having many different connections. CLT panels connect to the concrete core via bolted connections, and glue lamp columns on the second floor are bolted into the concrete transfer slab. To wrap my presentation up, climate is changing and so must the architecture around it. Through the use of bioclimatic design principles such as natural ventilation, carbon sequestration and storage, natural daylighting, architects and designers can take that next step in creating net zero and climate positive architecture that will reduce climate change and create safe, healthy, and visually appealing communities to provide human comfort in heavily dense urban areas. This concludes my presentation. I would like to thank you for your time and attention. I would now like to open the floor to any questions or concerns the jury might have. Thank you.
All right, so we'll use this mic for the jury so that people on Zoom or the YouTube live stream can hear the conversation. We have a little bit of an expedited window for conversation. We have around 15 minutes inclusive of Ming, the chair, who's on Zoom, who will conclude with. So I'll pass the microphone over. Oh, also welcome Robin to the jury with Bill, Ali, and Omar. So I'll pass it over for whoever wants to.
Well, you were incredibly thorough, I think, especially in your like depth of understanding and research on the bioclimatic approach. I think you were incredibly thorough when it comes to understanding and combining systems. I thought you were very thorough in terms of kind of putting together a building from a programmatic standpoint where you've got the units sorted, you thought about unit mixes, you thought about the types of amenity spaces that are included within those and how to kind of, that Tetris diagram, how to, create an environment, essentially kind of a neighborhood vertically. So all of those things you were very thorough about and tried to represent and brought us through your presentation in a way so that we understood your thinking about those things. So the feedback I have for you kind of going forward, especially kind of what you would take and maybe take into the next steps of your career, is don't forget about the kind of the poetry, the beauty, the fun. That's an important part, because what I'm trying to understand from your drawings, and I think some of it's there, but it's maybe also how it's presented, is just like, where's your process? Because I would assume at some point in your process, you started with an architectural idea, and I'm having a little trouble pulling that out from where you are, the way you've presented this, like even with projects that are represented relatively kind of pragmatically, like that Sequoia House project, there is an idea that's kind of evident in the architecture and the architectural representation. I'm having a little bit of a hard time with that. I think it's the long flat facade. Maybe I think, I'd love to see what the back of the building looks like. I thought potentially some of these large pass-throughs were actually kind of like open through to the bridge, because as an urban person, you also have to consider what the view of, the other users of that kind of area are. What is the view from the bridge, and how would that work? And then the last thing I'll say is just, I've been to this area in Long Island City, and the urban condition on the ground plane is a little bit to be determined based on how many new projects are happening. And I'm not convinced yet that you've made like a dynamic, fun neighborhood to be in that extends the feeling of the fun and enjoyable places of New York and Long Island and that area. Like the quality that you get 4 or 5 blocks from from your building site, I'd love to see how you could have brought that in and brought that eclectic, dynamic, multicultural energy to the ground plane. This feels like you solved the problem, but I'm not feeling where kind of humanity kind of comes in. And I just say one last thing: if you're putting up drawings and images from others, make sure to just give kind of a little caption at the bottom, copyright credit to who those images are, so we know what's yours and what's not. That's important.
Rock commons model. but
Got it.
I can.
Yeah, sure.
Should you go based on order of seating?
However you want to do it.
Yeah, I agree with Omar. A lot of really good decisions, some curious ones that I'll get into, but first off, I want to commend you on the kind of the holistic nature by which you approach the thesis question. Even kind of, walking us through climate change. I feel like some of that is somewhat redundant, so you can kind of more rapidly get to the kind of the core of thesis. I think we're all kind of living in that kind of climatic reality. So I think some of that could be kind of backgrounded a little bit, so we have a little bit more time to kind of discuss the meats and the bones of the project. But in general, I agree with the whole kind of poetry. Where's the fun? It feels like you're kind of designing the project as a technical object, right? Or a technical solution to something that is much larger than kind of technical solutions, right? So the climatic kind of condition that we're inheriting is beyond kind of technical solutions, right? It involves kind of social, political decisions. It involves kind of, designing a brand new society, right? That can deal with all of these coming changes. So in a sense, that's where I feel like some more creativity could be injected in the project, right? Even the kind of the massing of the project, you kind of pointed towards kind of energy efficiency, right? As opposed to what it's doing urbanistically, right? How is it creating views? How is it creating kind of contextual relationships? You did get into the idea of this kind of cut, right, between your two main masses, which I appreciate a lot. It kind of gives access to the city, to the river, right, which right now it doesn't have necessarily. But I think a little bit more creativity in terms of what is life like beyond the kind of, the kind of somewhat standard renders that we see here. What is life? What are the patterns of living here, right? How is it kind of situating itself within this kind of larger context, right? I'm a great believer in non-isolated architecture. By that, I mean, especially in a city like Long Island City or New York, and for that matter, you can't escape urbanity or the urban questions that are kind of, pressuring the project. So in that sense, all of the kind of climatic and environmental diagrams that you have situate the building as this kind of object within this kind of, abstract space, right? Whereas the urban space is far from abstract, right? I understand some of those kind of the black blocks, those are to be constructed, so those are not existing right now. The tall buildings that you have in your renderings and on your plan.
Yeah.
So those don't exist.
They do not exist. No.
So in a sense, instead of kind of working in this kind of abstract condition where you get the perfect sun angle, you get the perfect breeze, right? That kind of activates your passive cooling and kind of ventilation systems, you do have to contend for all of that, for the sunlight, for air, with these massive buildings that are going, right? So in a sense, I think your diagrams need to more realistically look at how much sun you have to deal with, right? What are the kind of the angles of sun in relationship to the neighboring building, right? That you're going to get. Is air going to actually flow as you've kind of diagrammed always from the south, right? Because now that you have these, again, masses of buildings on the way, airflow changes, right? And so kind of a little bit more grain, a little bit more grittiness, right, with regards to how the project is kind of both situating itself within the context, but also the responses, the architectural responses that you have need to consider that kind of more gritty reality. Sorry, I've already spoken too much.
I have nothing further to say. I share the sentiment. This is a very competent project. I think you solved, fundamentally some problems of sunlight. You've solved the siting. You're up against a bridge. You've split the building with a community center. These are all sort of polite gestures that you did.
Mhm.
But I agree that maybe you didn't go far enough. You have an opportunity here. Zaha Hadid says, context is your friend. So you've got to ask what am I solving? What are the questions? So I have orientation, which you've dealt with. You have a single load condition against a bridge, but you're not that close to the bridge, or maybe you are. I don't know what's the distance that you're away from the bridge face at the smallest point. 50 feet,
About
100
50 feet, yeah.
50 feet. Okay. So you do kind of have a zone where you're up against the bridge and other zones where you're above the bridge and below the bridge. You didn't really treat those differently. You have an opportunity, and I like the Ally idea about delight. I mean, you need some delight. Can I go out somewhere and get really close to the bridge? Excuse me. So you have opportunities for things to happen. I think your floor plans are very light in yield. Okay. Maybe you could have a single statement of how air moves through here. You've taken 50% of a floor plan and have it open, but maybe there's a way to do that. And I'm thinking of Corb's Unite, where you have 2-story units that go through. So every unit has a through, right? So every unit has flow through. You don't have to have those big openings, because Mr. Developer, sorry, I work for developers. I know Omar does too. You've got to have a certain amount of yield there. So I think you could think about those kinds of things. And maybe the community center, instead of being outside the building, is under the bridge, because that's probably, I'll venture to say, maybe that's cheap land that could be bought or could be leased for a community center rather than a residence. So you could tuck that in, and now you have an efficiency there. So I'll say that again, competent idea, but it needs some really special things to happen to make it sing.
Well, congratulations on this big project. It's you have to do a lot of work to get to a point where we can look at it and see more. So a really nice way of bringing us through the project and showing your analysis. I think the daylighting is really a great place to start, because that has to do with the occupants' experience in the building and energy. I think in this climate, in our climates, the natural ventilation is difficult because we have so much humidity. So there are a few months of the year that you can get that benefit, but maybe as a strategy for a whole building, that's something that having operable windows would be enough to give people fresh air, I think. So just as a strategy, that might not be your number one, but definitely the sun exposure. You talked about shading, and you've got big southern exposures. So I'm talking about, this, you've given us a great starting point. So these are takeoff points. One thing you could go further with the sunlight exposure is your shading. So what are the shading strategies on that south exposure? Having your windows slightly inset with the high angle in the summer, you're going to get some shading just from the thickness of your walls. And then jumping to the kind of the planning, the layout, I agree with comments that this will be a much bigger development eventually. And so maybe each building doesn't have to provide these community-based gestures, that there could be some overall planning for the whole development that would have a single point of community. And And then I'm looking at your renderings or your towers. I really like the expression of the residential building. You're using wood, you're getting places for green space. But it doesn't seem to relate. The two buildings don't really talk to each other. I think you could push that a little bit further to use similar materials. You've got small and big. So, how do you relate those two a little more to each other?
Mm.
And then one more comment, you're right on the river, but you don't seem to be engaging too much with the river. And you have introduced this diagonal, which is, I guess, connecting with the ferry terminal. Maybe the residential building, if that had turned just a little bit, you could have more views and broadsides to the river. But lots of site elements to talk about, and so many places you could keep going. So thank you.
And we'll transition to Ming online to conclude. We can
Can
hear
you
you.
hear me? Okay. First of all, I want to express my heartfelt appreciation to Andrew for undertaking this important topic. And I want to acknowledge the effort he has put into completing this master thesis. In this thesis, I think Andrew has touched upon the connection between the built environment and climate change, highlighting the potential for architectural design to contribute to the sustainable future. In this particular thesis, Andrew proposed a new design approach that prioritized the building climatic mitigation role as the primary design driver, rather than relying on abstract big concept. I think this is where a lot of juries kind of hinged on and the comments on. The thesis also proposed some strategy for improving energy efficiency, reduce carbon emission, and creating reliable, resilient, and comfortable living spaces. I think all those proposed strategies can be further developed into practical solution and a better solution. So Andrew, your commitment and passion for exploring the bioclimatic design are truly commendable. Meanwhile, the invaluable comments and suggestions Andrew have received from all the jury actually is a testament to jury's belief in his potential. So Andrew, I want to encourage you to capture this opportunity to further sharpen your design skill overall, and particularly in bioclimatic design. Lastly, I want to express my deep gratitude to all committee members and the juries today for taking time out of your busy schedule to participate this earlier master thesis presentation and provide Andrew with really useful and invaluable comments and suggestions. Your time, guidance, and expertise are greatly appreciated by all of us. Thank you.
All right. Thank you,
Thank you.
Ming. Thank you, Andrew. We're going to rotate 90 degrees this way and transition to the next student. Here, I got it. Let's just.
I was traveling everything.
Bye, Ming. Safe travels.
We'll deal with it on the.
Thank you.
And just for those of you out there in the real environment of the great space, Ming tuned in to us from China, where the local time is now 10 p.m. So she's 12 hours different than us at the present time.
Try to stand back. A little awkward position here, kind of.
Time. You can go to this side if you want to not trip over it when you go to your bar. But whenever you're ready. And use the mic.
Good morning, everybody. I'm happy to be here. Thank you very much to come and listen to my presentation. My name is Konstantin Gulisashvili. I came from Republic of Georgia many years ago, and I will take you to capital of Georgia, Tbilisi. This thesis project will take you to capital and will try to give Georgians, middle-class Georgians, residential units that will make them join together, connect them, and to allow them to return to their normal ways of living. Because 3 years, it has been very different, very different very different social life where people were not able to connect with each other. They were completely disconnected. Georgia located on the coast of Black Sea between Russia and Turkey. It has many different names. Different countries and different languages, they pronounce Georgia differently. For example, in Georgian, we don't call Georgia, country Georgia, we call it Sakartvelo, and we are Kartveli, which means land of Georgian. We have very unique language, which is not same as Russian or any other language. You can see writing up there up top. Alphabet is very different. It's very unique. There's 14 alphabets in the world, and this is one of them. Georgia is thousands of years old. It has had different names through the history. One of those names was Colchida, and if you're familiar with Greece mythology, Golden Fleece, where Jason went with Argonauts and get the Golden Fleece, he went to Kolcha, and that was Georgia. And it was on the coast of the Black Sea. People in Georgia are very proud to be Georgians. They have a huge history, but what really stands out in Georgia is hospitality. If you ever been in Georgia, you would know how important guests are for Georgians. You always are welcome. They'll bring you inside. They will give you food, wine. They'll stay with you. They'll take you everywhere. They'll show you Georgia. Every comment from anybody you ever meet who went to Georgia will say the first thing would be is hospitality is amazing. Population of Georgia is very small. It's only over 3 million people, and we kind of know each other. If, for example, in the United States, a community is very small, and even if I don't know somebody, then my father would know that person. So it's a very small community. We know each other, or we know somebody that knows that person. Every Georgian is proud to be Georgian. We really try to get together, connect, even here. Man, I feel like United States, we're a little bit disconnected because of the distance. You can't just walk to your Georgian friend. I think that it is very important for Georgians to be together, to socialize with each other. Capital of Georgia, Tbilisi, it is unknown exactly how many centuries Georgia, Tbilisi was there, but records say from the 4th century there has been a fortress on the territory of Georgia, but it didn't happen, wasn't officially called a city until the 5th century when King Vakhtang Gorgasali, who was, and that's a legend, there's few versions. The one I like is when he was hunting on the grounds around current Tbilisi, he shot the mountain goat and he fell into the river. And when he fell, when they got out the goat from the river, it was cooked already because the waters were really warm. So that's why they call it Tbilisi, which is a warm city. Tbilisi. Tbilisi is warm in Georgian. Many scholars believe that Tbilisi was on the road of alternate road of Silk Road, because when there were during medieval times, when there were wars in the area, they would alter the roads through Tbilisi towards the Black Sea, and then they would load the ships, and ships would travel to Greece or Italy. However, many wars came to city. It was taken down many times, got the freedom, and pretty much destroyed and rebuilt several times. And right now there are really no, at least definitely no residential buildings past 18th century, because everything was either destroyed or remodeled, redone completely. In Georgian called Banyani city, which means that when saying before 18th century, actually before 19th century, you could walk on the roofs of the houses in Tbilisi and you would never have to step down on the ground, and you would be able to walk around the city because somebody's front yard would be somebody else's roof. So that's Bani in Georgian means flat surface or square place together. So later, after the 18th century, when European influence began in Georgia, government required to start building houses only with a specified design. You were not able to elaborate. It had to be only certain designs. So what Georgians did, they started creating courthouses where they were able to create this Georgian atmosphere inside of the building. And that's when really courthouses thrived in Tbilisi. Through the history, courthouses began like 6,000 years ago. However, there were so many different reasons to do that, for privacy, for the light. social aspect. But in Georgia, it was truly the social aspect that created those courtyards. So people could get together and have their own space, and they were able to create space they liked. Later, when Soviets came in 1921 and took over Georgia, the first thing they did is to took these courtyard houses that were really nice, elaborate courthouses, and said that one person or just one family could not live there anymore. You had to put many people in one house. So they started dividing, putting more walls inside and putting more people. There were 15 families lived in one courthouse. I lived for 10 years in a courthouse like that. It was 18 families. We had to share bathrooms. So like 3 families would have one bathroom, and we had to share kitchens. Actually, my dad had to share a kitchen. When I was growing up already, they somehow remodeled, so we got our own kitchen, but we didn't have a bathroom. And the way it was done, they started building a little inside and taking away the courtyard space, kind of building it out inward. Later in 50s and 60s, Soviets came with a new idea of giving everybody a house. So anybody, you didn't have to buy a house in Soviet Union. You just could get the house. If you had a job, you get online and you get an apartment. And in order to provide these apartments for a huge population, what they did, they just started building slabs, this point towers. 5 or 6 years I lived in a situation like this, where you just walk in your foyer, you go up the stairs, and you only know like people, maybe know people that live on your section of the house, not on the like next to the entrance. So it didn't belong to anybody. You didn't have the ownership of the stairs, for example. It was terrible. It was really nobody looked after it. It started falling apart completely. And in these pictures, you can see how it's really falling apart right now. It is important to talk about topography in Georgia. It's very mountainous area. There are mountains on both sides, on north and south, which protected Georgia for years. And the important one is there is a mountain going across from right here, where it splits Georgia into halves. So West Georgia is very humid, subtropic area. And well, here is subtropic. And then west part is very humid. I'm sorry, very east part is very dry. That's where Tbilisi is. This is old plan of Tbilisi. There's a little red dot is a site plan where it is used to be suburb of Tbilisi, and downtown was on the right. Now we call it Old Tbilisi. Here's the modern times. It's really site is in really downtown, right in the middle, next to the main square. Here's a site plan, existing site plan. It is important to say that right now it is undeveloped at all. It has one-story buildings. They're falling apart. It's by US standards, you would not be even allowed to live there. It's in such a bad condition. And on the right side, that's proposed buildings, where all the idea is that all the buildings face to the main street that goes down to the main square. In turn, all the streets around kind of connect and go down to the main square up top. The main square is located up top right here. And it is important to note that the site has a subway right close by, subway stop, bus stop, and cable car. As well, they're going an amusement park right on top of the mountain, because that area is, the mountain really dives up after that location. Here's a couple of precedent studies I did. The one on the left is what the Soviets have built. And on the right, that's a modern recent building where tendencies to create the courtyards again. It's a courtyard environment, social, really social area between the buildings. Mostly 1 and 2 bedroom apartments are really Georgians have interest in those, because through generation, we used to live with large families, grandmothers, great-grandmothers, parents, kids all live together. But now younger Georgians from this Western influence trying to get away and move forward and live by themselves. And they need more of a 1, 2 bedroom apartments. And that's what they really can afford. Proposed project is over 8,000 square meters. Quarter of this area designed for the courtyards. That's the social area to get together. And 1 and 2 bedrooms are prioritized. I have looked at the area around the site to see how different buildings work together, how the facades work. These are mostly residential buildings, except one on the right bottom that's right next, just to a side. It is a public building. Working with elevation, I try to connect from here where the buildings are a little larger, the public, try to connect with the smaller residential buildings on the right, which are a few stories. But my idea was that eventually will be built up as well. But right now I'm just trying to connect, articulate facades here into the residential area. On the west side, the opposite side, they're both residential buildings that are on both sides. And I was trying to kind of join them together into this complex where you can enter and through the building into the courtyard. Here is a picture of a courtyard. It's not just a courtyard, not just a social area to me. It is also the single loaded corridor that I created around the courtyard that would allow you to meet people and connect them. So if you look at the ground plan, you'll see that there's a single loaded corridor. There's entrance and exits. It's a semi-private area because Georgians are very friendly. You don't want to completely close down the courtyard. It is normal for people, tourists come in Georgian courtyard, just walk in and you get a tour for free. This is a normal situation. So that's why I try to keep it open so people can pass through. Mostly 1 and 2 apartment buildings in blue. In red, it's a commercial area that is close to the main square. And then in green, those are mostly like for public areas, for room to rent if you want to have a party. And Georgians like party a lot, huge parties usually. So they need some space. And the gym as well would be good to work out because this Western influence is really big in Georgia now. On the upper levels, this is a typical floor. We have 1 and 2 story, 1 and 2 bedroom buildings mostly. There are a couple, several 3 bedroom units, but they are not as needed in Georgia at the moment. here is so 1-bedroom units would be mostly on the long sides, and in the corners there will be 2-bedroom units because they're a little bit large, more space and a little bit larger. And I want to thank you for listening to my presentation. I want to thank you, my committee, because it was really very interesting ride for me. You probably can tell I'm not 25. It's a second career for me. And I love what I do. And I love this even more. I started as a fun activity at first, but 7-8 years later, I'm here. I want to thank you, the school, because school was really good to me, helped me with allowing me to work and study as well. So that was great. And I would like to thank you, Professor Bell, who really changed how I see architecture. And I'm open for questions or comments. We'll be happy to hear from you.
Thank you for your presentation. I see this as really. How's that? Great. All right, so this is very much an urban studies kind of program, and I like the background of how the community and the social life is important in Georgia, and so your desire is to infill the city and recreate these connections and these pathways. I like the form of your building, how you've got a lot of connection from the building itself to the courtyard. I think one thing that struck me is that, and even when I look at the title of your presentation, that you're communicating the courtyards. I would like to see a little more emphasis on how these 3 buildings connect with themselves, and maybe you start to overlay another kind of circulation that's not the big streets, but is the more residential and the connection through the courtyards. So, you know, each building has the potential to come out of the apartment itself, come into the courtyard as a larger space. Maybe your 3 buildings then can create another step up where these 3 courtyards might connect to each other more, or create ways that you move through the city through the courtyards to get to the public square. And then on the articulation of the buildings themselves, I'd like to see a little more celebration of the entrance to these courtyards. I'm not sure which of these openings go into the courtyard when I look at the elevation. So maybe that would be a way of linking one courtyard to another, is that you see this entrance is a little bit different. This goes to the open space. This is the more public way of accessing the life here. And then you have another layer where you get into the lobby of the building, and then another where you get into the house of the unit itself. So I think you really have the desire to relink things, but I think you can keep pushing the arrangement of your buildings and the articulation of your buildings to kind of build up those layers.
Thank you.
Constantine, thanks for pulling this together, teaching us a little bit about Georgia. I know some Georgian people, not only our local wine store, but a wonderful Georgian restaurant on 11th Street. So Supra, yes. I've had lots of bread there. I know the bread is quite a staple. I would certainly like to go to this 1.1 million person city. I think it would be fascinating. I also enjoy multifamily residential architecture in urban locations. So both David and I do a lot of this. I'm going to pick up on Robin's comment. I think that you have an opportunity here, and I know you're not done with this, but as a good start, showing a single loaded scenario for living, communicating courtyards, they're very internalized. So I'm not sure they support your thesis in that regard, but they can be opened out, and they could also be different building configurations that you could explore, double loaded or pod based or some other typologies on a site of 3 buildings, which could be a good exploration in multifamily housing. I think you've done a nice job with your courtyards. I assume that ground floor, that's the public areas. I would like to see some communication through, and Professor Bell probably advised you to do your own NOLI plan of the city, which we would have done here at Maryland as a exercise. But thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, great project. I really appreciate the kind of getting to know Georgia a little bit. A couple of things that you brought up in that kind of context building that you did in the beginning that I wish could have been carried through a little bit more rigorously. One is the idea of, the courtyards, which has already been mentioned, not being these kind of internalized private spaces, but they're really city spaces that are sheltered a little bit from the noise and congestion and the activity of the city, right? So kind of opening the courtyards up. The other one was this super interesting sectional idea of, how to build a city in a kind of highly topographic area, right? The idea of the roofs becoming the yards for other houses, which I think you do have an opportunity given your massing and how you're kind of constructing these different levels of the project to activate those kind of upper courtyards, right? So I kind of look at them as extensions of the life of the courtyard, kind of extending itself or pulling itself through the mass of the building and of activating different heights and different kind of sectional conditions of the building. So that's one thing that I missed a little bit. Like I was expecting you to kind of, because you mentioned it and you kind of gave it a lot of room. So going back to that idea, what is the contemporary version of that, right? And how does that help situate and condition the building a little bit more urbanistically so it doesn't look like a fortress, right? Because that's a totally different logic of building. It's building as a kind of open mat, right? Where you can enter in multiple kind of ways, right? And there is kind of activities. But otherwise, I think the kind of the single loaded corridor kind of typology that you've picked on, I think works in this case. I wasn't super sure of it in the last project given the context, but I feel like it works here. But I still would like to see, I mean, given the life and the activity of the courtyard, I would love to have a window onto the courtyard, right? And right now there is no opportunity for any of the units to actually open a meaningful relationship to the courtyard. So, but I also see these as kind of social spaces that are like those kind of the yards up in the height of the building. They're extending the social life of the building into the mass. And finally, I think the courtyards, the way you're designing them, it feels like each of them have a very specific characteristic, right? I wish you had, few more weeks to spend on kind of teasing out what makes each of those courtyards special, right? Because you don't want to do the same thing over and over again. And I'm not suggesting you're doing that, but kind of teasing out what makes each of those courtyards special. So there is kind of cross relationship across them. There is a reason for the kind of the urbanity of the context to be pulled through the courtyards, right? Maybe there's festivals, there's these parties that you mentioned, which sound interesting. And how do those activate each of the courtyards in a more specific way, right? As opposed to kind of generally, the elements are the same. It's how you compose them that's different, very different. And what I'm suggesting is maybe even conceptually, the courtyards could be differentiated from one another. But great job.
Thank you.
Hey, Constantine. So when I was looking at these boards, I was thinking, okay, this person has, is essentially trying to restitch, kind of rebuild the 18th and 19th century urban fabric of the Georgian capital, right? Like that's what these look like to me, right? I see the kind of connection in the sketches you did of adjacent buildings and how some of the classical elements from those buildings kind of connect the proportion, the use of arches, the way the kind of upper courtyard, I think I'm understanding where the trees are, how that all connects, the use of balconies. It feels appropriate to the city from a kind of urban preservation, urban kind of fabric standpoint, the way you used materials on the base that connects across to me. I understand it, I see it, and how this could be a meaningful, reconstruction or strengthening of the downtown fabric. But I saw your presentation and I was like, wow, the Banyan City. I was like, incredible research, really cool. Wow, that was and then the way you described it as this way of moving through the city. And then you could almost see it in some of the Soviet architecture where you're saying like they had built this skyway through and they kind of infilled a couple of those units with masonry blocks. But you could see that maybe someone was like, no, let's bring in some of the Banyan City again. And then he showed the images of the courtyard and the dynamism of that. And I got excited about that. And then you started talking about the climate of Georgia and the east side versus the west side. And I started getting excited about that. And then I looked back at your presentation. I was like, where is it? Where is all of that research, that design, that kind of, that connects to the design understanding of the past of the city, how or the country, where does that manifest itself here? And I'm just kind of following up basically on what Bill and Robin and Ali were talking about. It was like, where is that happening? I'm missing that. And I'm not passing judgment because I don't know what you're Georgian, I'm not. You're creating a proposal for your city, for your country, with your cultural understanding of it. But if you are interested in those things and drawing from the ways that buildings were built or the ways that people lived in a city, and finding some inspiration in that and some modern version of that, or some, it's not to say that I don't propose that you would memorialize the fact that 18 people had to share one bathroom. Right? Like that's probably in some ways not the best memory, right? But is there part of that dynamism that you do look back on, that you kind of feel fondly about, that the energy and the connectivity? And then where does that come here? And it's important to remember when you're working on projects of such a large scale, it's sometimes hard to think of everything at once. So you're thinking of and you're building up this category of ideas, right? And then you might come back to this category of ideas and you might kind of work on that. It's sometimes hard to triangulate everything and keep all the balls in the air, at the same time. But I think kind of thinking about your next steps is don't forget to circle back around, and pick back up your research and go, does this belong here? Where did these ideas go? Did I leave this behind? Should it be back in here? And kind of circle back and really try to say, oh, I was really inspired by this, but I'm not seeing it. And then don't be afraid to change it if you feel like it's missing and it's important to you.
Thank you.
No problem.
Hi.
Hello.
I hang out at batch 13 a lot, so I know the Georgian guys down there. They're great folks, very friendly. So
Thank you.
like what I know about your country. So I think this is interesting, well done urban insertion in good part of the city. I think that I agree with Ali that the courtyards are ignored, and if you look at Nuni Reitig, I see her picture up on the wall there. Her mom, Suzanne, has done a lot of single loaded corridor projects in DC. And I think it's worth you looking at that to understand how she makes a back and forth connection. Because, rarely do you have an opportunity. Not many of our projects have single loaded corridors, but once you make that commitment, make sure that you're taking advantage of the social space that you're creating in the center of the courtyard. I think your architecture is, you didn't go through your material stacking and what you were thinking on the architecture of the buildings, but there's a consistency, a high degree of sameness to each one of the buildings. And I look at your project and I see a variety of massing notions that you're trying to create, almost like scaled buildings that fit within the context of the city, but the architecture has a tremendous amount of sameness to it. So you're always pairing floors together. When you get above the first floor, you are always pairing windows together, except when you're doing the arched openings. And, you know, there's a lot of tremendous consistency that I wish you had explored a little bit, some other opportunities to accentuate the different massings that you've accumulated on the outside, on the wrappers of the building. So I think it's a good project and kind of mature project. So probably goes with your advanced stage. So
Thank you.
thanks.
Hello, Costa. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm okay. Well. Lots of times what happens in Thesis, Brian Kelly and I used to joke that, you know, sometimes students arrive at a point for a thesis project and it's like, there's something wrong with my hometown. And this project might be able to do something about it. And Tbilisi is always a place I've wanted to go because it's a beautiful, beautiful city. And I've been to those Soviet neighborhoods outside cities in the former Soviet Union, and they are absolutely frightening, dreadful places. And it's amazing they didn't have more social problems in a lot of those places. And fortunately for Tbilisi, a lot of that kind of stuff didn't get brought into the center of the city, I think. There's still a lot of kind of ramshackle stuff, 1- and 2-story things that kind of was there because it was a poor society and the money wasn't there to reinvest and stuff. But the Soviets were very good at these kind of mass production housing estates on the perimeter of cities. And when Costa was doing his thesis research about a site to do, we were talking about some of those. And then I said to him finally, I said, but isn't there some place in the center that needs work? And he said, Matt, Professor Bo, all the places in the center need work. So, you know, because it's not a problem of the Soviet stuff, even though that's what you experienced, it's a problem of the fact that it didn't go through the kind of evolution that industrial cities, at least in Western Europe and the United States, went through, where there was a healthy middle class building apartment buildings, which is happening now there. And so when you know, we got paired up for thesis, I thought, well, this is going to be fun because I'm going to learn a lot about Tbilisi, which Costa certainly knows a great deal, and it's been a lot of fun talking about Tbilisi and learning what's going on there. I think the jury comments are right about the courtyards in a sense. You know, I mean, at one level, yeah, they could communicate more. Sometimes it's more programming that goes on in these things. You know, if you make it possible for someone to have a restaurant that's really cool in a courtyard, that kind of thing can go a long way to making these things more community assets and stuff. So it's not always the architecture that does that. It can be other things as well. I would point out to folks as well, you know, he got down to the level of unit design, which we insisted on the committee because I think it's really important for a student to be able to go from a conception of a city all the way down to how people live in it to get to that scale. And that's really an important accomplishment, you know. Costa has a number of campaign medals from his thesis experience of the campaign medal from crit number 1 and the campaign medal from crit number 2, because we were very, very insistent that he draw the whole project, that he draw the facades and he draw the unit plans. And at the end, when Brian and I sat down, Brian finally said, well, look, you need to get back to this idea of courtyards. And I think there was so much for Costa to solve in terms of the facades and other things that I think the courtyards kind of get left a little bit sort of behind, and coming back to them, at least in some measure, that you've done is really good. I do think the comments David made about the facades are interesting in terms of thinking about how one would elaborate it. I think though, what's sort of interesting, I think about this project too, is that I think what Costa is providing for perhaps is a model for infill, kind of meat and potatoes infill that cities need. Not the kind of stuff that's trying to scratch your ear like this, but stuff that just is really good infill and provides a context in a meaningful way that is recognizable and legible to the people who live there. And so using that existing building, that lovely, he didn't show very good pictures of it, but that building there down there on the bottom left by his hand there is absolutely beautiful, absolutely stunning piece of architecture. Yeah, that one there. You sort of didn't show very many pictures of it, and became sort of a model for how to start to think about the facades. I have to say, Costa, I'm very pleased to see that you've gotten this far. And I know Professor Kelly, I don't know, Brian, if you want to add a couple of comments here before I close.
Sure. Costa, as Matt said, sometimes the going was rough. I know you were trying to juggle a full life outside of school too, with responsibilities. But I think one of the things at the end of the day is how people rise to the occasion. You discover a lot about their character and their abilities. And there are a lot of times where you and I had a knockdown dragouts about the vertical surface, and you've made tremendous improvement there. And I think you're well on your way. I think one of the things that I would say about the courtyard, if I had opportunity to look at the courtyard a little bit closer, is some of the best courtyards I know of all have a sort of transitional zone between the interior and the exterior of the building that wrap around them in a variety of ways. A loggia, a porch, whatever, something that is a kind of intermediate space between inside and outside. And I think you would find that would make that ground level of the courtyard, at the very least, much more dynamic and much more the kind of space that you envision. But anyhow, I wish you the best. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Costa, it's been fun working with you. I appreciate your good humor and your willingness to take extremely direct criticism there, and to come back, like the little toy that has the sand in the bottom, to come back, bounce right back up and go forward with all the criticism you received at a bunch of different levels. And I think your passion for your hometown shows in this thesis, which is, I think, what you wanted to do. And I think this isn't just a love letter to the Tbilisi of the past, but it's a love letter to the Tbilisi that could be in the future. So congratulations.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll do a 5-minute pause while we turn the boards for the second half of the morning presentation.
That's an intermezzo. It will happen. But realize those are very small blocks. You could have been bigger. Yeah. You could have
Reminded we need to start going. 2-minute warning. Who's your chair?
Gabrielle.
Okay, I have it written down, but just good to know. How you feeling? Great. That's a place to be. Okay, jury members, let's gather for the second half of the morning. Yeah, go for it. Better to do it all now. All right, let's gather the faculty and the jury. Any students in the room? Yeah, we'll start on this side. And we'll. Just so you're not. Yeah. Surprised. We do a lot of introductions. Yesterday we did it like that every year. During number 9. Any bios. All right, please join us in the great space. If you can hear this, if you're a jury member, a faculty, a student, we're going to start with our next presentation. But before we do, we're going to redo our introductions one more time. There's lots more people in the room. So we'll do the jury introductions and then move on to the student presentation.
Good morning, everyone. Still morning, right? My name is Ali Fard. I'm an assistant professor at UVA. I teach between architecture and urban environmental planning, and our new program, urban design, which is exciting. So, yeah.
Hi, I'm Robin McGrew. I'm with Peabody Fine Architects. We're a high performance based practice of residential architecture. And it's nice to be here this morning.
Hello, my name is Omar Hakim. I'm an architect. I run a small practice called 2B Studio. We focus on projects related to social and environmental equity. And yeah, happy to be here.
Thanks again for having me. I'm Bill Bonster, 83 BArch grad, involved in Alumni Association and in the school for many, many years, and have a thriving practice in DC, 35 architects, and happy to be here.
Thank you.
Yep, and I'm David Harrison. I'm Bill's partner in our thriving architecture practice. And, I've juried here and critted here for a number of years on and off. And I'm a UVA grad also, so we have a lot of connection there. So
Great. So we have 2 presentations to close out the morning session. We'll be here and then we'll rotate 90 degrees for the last presentation of the morning.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name is James Rennick Long. I'll be presenting to you my thesis titled Step into Green. I'd like to start off by thanking my wife for helping me get through the semester and all of school while taking care of 2 kiddos so that I can focus. So thank you. So the premise of Step into Green is to rethink how we design and develop urban environments, specifically denser cityscapes. And how can we do so in such a way that integrates green space from the city scale all the way down through the neighborhood and community to individual units? And how can we measure the success of that scheme by the scalability of those outdoor spaces to be viable for urban agriculture? And this is especially suited to my chosen location, which is Baltimore City, because there are large areas of food insecurity. Baltimore labels them as food priority, healthy food priority areas. And they have no access to grocery stores with fresh produce. There are a number of community gardens, but there are sizable gaps in that coverage as well. And then of the various food halls and market halls, there still remain pretty large gaps. So anyone that has no personally owned vehicle and is reliant on public transit, they are pretty much out of luck in a lot of these regards, and they have to go pretty far out of their way to get any food. So how can we integrate these green spaces and do them in a way that those that are able and willing can grow some of their own food to negate that food insecurity? And if there are those that do not have the time, gumption, or ability to do so, how can their community come together to help support them in that regard? So if we take a look at our first map here of Baltimore, you can see this is showing all the supermarkets and convenience stores. So everything that you see in a blue G is a grocery store that has fresh produce. And the convenience stores, which are pretty prominent throughout Baltimore, typically have few options for fresh produce. It's usually highly processed foods. So that does not help us at all. And then we will look at the green spaces, including gardens. Again, kind of northern Baltimore has pretty good coverage. A lot of these areas are a little bit more affluent. And so they have pretty good coverage in that regard. But especially in the west and a little bit in the south and east, you start to get these gaps. So the site we are looking at is specifically Harlem Park, which is in western Baltimore. This is an area that has been underserved for a long while. You can trace this back to redlining, as well as the highway to nowhere. And it's led to this current condition where they're smack dab in the middle of a pretty sizable food desert area, the largest one in Baltimore to be precise. So like I said, redlining, again, they're in that kind of that butterfly area in Baltimore that was kind of singled out and really inhibited economic growth. That led to what we have today, which is rampant vacancy throughout Baltimore. And Harlem Park is certainly no exception. The photo you can see here is of Harlem Avenue on the south side of Harlem Park. Large swaths of row homes that are completely vacant. Many are empty shells, no roofs. Some are just the facade with nothing behind them. And there are a number of vacant lots throughout the site. And then the highway to nowhere, Route 40, was another contributing factor that kind of split the community and again, made it more difficult for people to move about or to connect with their friends. So when we zoom into Harlem Park, we're looking specifically at the eastern edge of Harlem Park. Again, there is no grocery store. This is about a 5-minute walking area total. There's only a smattering of convenience stores. Again, these only have highly processed foods. They do not carry fresh produce. There's a number of restaurants, and that is it. So by targeting this area, we can implant a community market and garden that completely negates that food insecurity. And we can also kind of reimagine the inner block. A lot of these areas, especially in Harlem Park, historically had slums in the inner block areas. And Baltimore went in and removed those slum buildings and replaced them with these green spaces which all sounds well and good, except that the culture in these areas was that people would congregate at their front stoops. And it is a street life. You would go out front of your house to meet with your friends and your family and to just converse with passersby. So having these inner blocks that were completely shut off from main thoroughfares went against that culture. And they quickly fell into disrepair. And again, a significant detractor to the area, both in terms of quality and livelihood. So approaching this, I kind of looked at several different schemes. All of these look to reconstitute the inner block with defined edges. And how can we bring that front porch life to the inner block? And we also want to connect these green spaces. That is the whole idea here, these integrated green spaces. So how can the existing green spaces and potential green spaces be linked in a way that increases visibility and movement through those spaces? So if we zoom into our site, this is kind of an aerial with a figure ground overlaid, so you can get a little bit of sense of what it looks like. If we just get rid of our vacant homes, in total, to make way for my scheme, we're only displacing 8 row houses and 1 residential tower. And so since we're dealing in a scenario where there's de-densification occurring year over year, how can we relocate these people by building up the area, not in an effort to densify, but in an effort to improve quality of life and have better integrated green space? That Southwest Tower obviously is a big offender in integrated green space, as it has none. So phase 1, we're just looking at demoing vacant buildings called out in orange. And we're renovating 3 of the vacant buildings that are in good shape. They just need a little TLC. And we're building 3 new row houses of a wider footprint. Typically, the row houses here are about 15 feet wide, which is a bit narrow. And they can be 50 or more feet deep. So there's not a lot of access to light and air. So we're proposing 22 plus foot width row houses. So those 6 additions, the 3 renovations, and then the 3 new ones, make way for demoing the other 6 row houses to make way for our scheme so that nobody is displaced. And we're adding 2 more row houses. That makes way for the next wave of old row houses that we're demoing. This is also the biggest change, where we have a inner block access street, and the inner block itself has well-defined edges with these new small footprint houses, which we'll talk about a little bit. Moving on through the phase, we now have made way for that new tower to the northeast. The old tower to the southwest can now be removed. We're building more of the new row house to make way for removing the last of the old row houses that we want to replace. And here we have finally connected that inner block to the western side of the neighborhood. And you can see Lafayette Square Park is actually up to the northwest. So we now have a connection through the entire site to Lafayette Square Park. And this is the next big move. We're adding the community market and garden. This becomes sort of the jewel box or anchor for the site. It's centrally located on axis through the inner block. It improves sightlines from main avenues into that inner block, while also affording some separation from the streets. And finally, we're building the mixed use building, which has a number of residences, restaurant, retail frontage, as well as a community center that is attached in program to the market. And this is the only phase where we're actually densifying, where we're building more to house more people than exists there currently. So we leave room for that potential densification in the future, but it works well without it as well. So this is what our final build out looks like. Obviously, streets as well would be replaced. Right now, streets vary in widths from 62 feet to 70 feet. And predominantly that is all hardscape, a number of trees, but that's it for green space. So these are being, roads are being narrowed so that complete streets can be put in. And in terms of plan, this really helps show the axiality of the plan. You see the connection from Lafayette Square Park to the northwest, down through our inner block, through our green space of the garden, and down what I'm dubbing the front porch plaza of the mixed use building that leads to the pocket park to the south. And here, just an overview site section. We'll next take a quick look at some of the new typologies that we're recommending, the new small footprint houses, the new row houses, and then the market and the mixed use building. So here's a vignette of the inner block. This is a pedestrian thoroughfare with a one-way street loop to serve the small footprint houses. And the market itself commands the end of it. That is the termination of that procession. And it's formed by these small footprint houses, which I envision as these kind of pseudo modular homes. And in their smallest form, they're about 500 square feet. That's a 16 by 32 foot house with an equal size plot of land. And these can easily be built out, forming Ls, starting to build out second stories. And they also come with their little plots of land. So at a minimum, you have 250 square feet, which to feed one person throughout a year enough fresh produce takes about 200 to 300 square feet of land. So any unit that has at least 200 square feet, you're making a sizable impact on food availability just through urban ag. And here looking from the north down through the new street, you see the new typologies of the small footprint house, the wider row house, and then the original row houses in the distance. So these row houses, like I said, the existing ones are pretty narrow. So by widening them, they do not have to be as deep to get comparable square footage. That means that we free up more land for the small footprint houses and retain enough land for those row houses to commit to urban ag if they so choose. And the small footprint houses are also kind of born out of this idea of the carriage house, which is a fairly common occurrence throughout Baltimore. The inner blocks have the carriage houses, garages facing them, but that doesn't make for a very nice edge, a bunch of garages. So instead of these carriage houses, since the lots can now be shrunk in depth, we give away that land to the small footprint house. So in terms of form, it's similar to the carriage house, but it presents a much more formal street edge, inner block edge. Now here looking at the market, this is a pretty simple structure, timber, steel, encased in glass. It'll have electrical, and that's about it. This is meant as an open space that has easy access through from the brick road to the garden, so that it can be used for pop-up markets, farmers markets, you name it. And just a quick look at the interior, that timber. These kind of bay dimensions are about 12 feet wide. So each vendor could have 12 feet or more in width and up to 17 feet deep in just a single stall space. And then finally, we're going to take a look at the mixed use building with the front porch plaza on the front. This is speaking to that historical culture of the area of people congregating in front of the house on the street. And so this entire plaza kind of steps down and spills onto the street to help encourage the growth of that culture. And looking at the balcony view here, you can see some of these little planter boxes. Each unit can have at least 250 square feet of green space just by these little planter boxes. A number of these units have 500 or more square feet. So it's pretty generous outdoor space. And there's no overhangs, so there's no limitation to access to sunlight along the east and south sides of the building. And the rooftop, the cornice along the brick facade portions is kind of a formal traditional cornice, and that transitions to planter boxes to grow herbs or ornamentals. And then a greenhouse on the top helps extend the growing season for the entire building as a community. And just looking at these kind of street level and plaza level helps navigate the slight topography change to the site. Entering the lobby through the street, you have access to elevator up to the plaza. And then the residents have a controlled entry core separate from that. So looking through the units, there's a pretty good distribution of units that have available green space. So over 20 of these units can have green space, and the majority of them have some sort of outdoor space or are corner or through units. And just you can get a sense for the disposition of interior versus exterior with green space. And then the penthouse, an L shape as well, with the greenhouse forming that L. So the massing was derived out of this process of looking at existing forms in the urban environment, particularly pocket parks where a vacant building is demoed and the land is converted into a little pocket park. So do we start to excavate a typical residential tower to form these pocket park areas? The problem with that is that you still have pretty deep shadows cast through a lot of the day. So that's not necessarily the best ideal. Alternatively, we can project out from the building. But anytime you have large projections, you start to run into challenges of supporting a large amount of green space on a projection. So that seemed like a poor choice. So we start looking at this simple stepping back, especially on the south and east side that have the most exposure to sunlight. And how do we incorporate that with more traditional massing so it's recognizable as something that is kind of born out of Baltimore. And that led to kind of hip roofs, pretty aggressive tower turret on the corner. Again, the stepping back here with this cantilever, but again, that starts to inhibit your access to daylight on the units below. And so that's how we finally got to this building, which is sort of a microcosm of the entire site in a very neat package. So that is how I propose we integrate green into Baltimore City. Thank you.
Since I received the mic, I'm gonna start. Couple of questions to get us going. First off, fantastic presentation. The narrative of it made total sense. The presentation itself was very tight and together, which I really appreciated. The drawings are beautiful. There's a lot of really good considerate moves, right? Both urbanistically, but also when it comes to the unit layout, its relationship to some of the public spaces and all of that is fantastic and really nicely done. But a couple of very basic questions. Do you have any metrics for how much food is produced in the quote unquote green areas in your project?
That really, if you were to look at that specifically just off the square footage, then typically the metric of 200 square feet per person stands true. As you get larger areas, that kind of starts to improve production versus square footage. So this, the community garden I'm proposing here is 4,000 square feet. So that makes a pretty good bite into number of people it can feed. And then greenhouses, you don't have quite as much production volume, but they can produce throughout the year because they're less susceptible to cold, et cetera. And so that's kind of a supplement to having a large garden that you have greenhouse. And in the colder months, you still have uninterrupted production.
But so, I mean, it's still looked at as supplemental food. It's not going to satisfy the fresh food needs of this entire community for the
Correct.
entire year. Okay,
Yes.
that's important because I think there you can begin to link it to this larger urban strategy of looking at these mid-block spaces, right? So looking at them as the kind of the productive landscapes, right, of your project, which a lot of the agriculture, urban agriculture actually gets done there. And then it is brought into the market and kind of distributed to the community. So really what you're creating is a nucleus of a much larger kind of urban proposal.
Yes.
Right. And I think that's important because I mean, in a lot of studies that I've been looking at, even going back to Frank Lloyd Wright and his Broad Acre City, I think like an acre seems to be like a more standard kind of, amount of space that would satisfy one person for an entire year, right? So it's a lot of space, right, that you need. And I guess the other impression that I got from the project, I was super excited when you started to talk about kind of, dealing with these mid-block conditions and kind of potentially turning them into green space. And again, like I would challenge you on using the word green, right? Because it could become a container for, anything green, right? Even grass on the lawn is green. But I think you have a very specific type of green in mind, which is this kind of productive urban agricultural spaces, right? So in that sense, I wouldn't necessarily count the kind of mid-block park that you have as a productive, I mean, it's socially productive, obviously, but it's not part of the urban agriculture kind of mandate of the project, right? But I think there is something there that you can kind of borrow from as well to kind of, encroach on that kind of social space, because a lot of this kind of urban agriculture and farming and kind of greenhouse could also host social activities, right? So in that sense, kind of expanding beyond the kind of the greenhouse and that little garden by the market, right? And kind of it's fine to kind of take over land because it goes back to the community. And then the other kind of thing that stood out for me was the idea of the stoop as this kind of social condenser space, right? There again, there is the issue of scale. Right. The stoop as a stoop, it operates as this kind of more intimate spatial condition, right? Which once you scale it up to that, it loses some of that intimacy, right? It loses that sense of ownership, right? That would be required for someone to kind of maintain that space and call it their own, invite people in, and the kind of smaller pockets of community begin to form. So I think just being aware of that doesn't replace the stoop, right? It just becomes a much larger kind of urban space, even though it's kind of inspired by it. But again, I commend you on a lot of these. I think kind of if you're very serious about food production in urban settings, you need to look at the issue of scale, and there is a lot of gray and built matter in place of something that I would think would be geared more towards urban agriculture. So that balance, I feel like it needs a little bit more work.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And as this progressed, I did kind of feel like this is a lot of built. Right. And like, am I doing this right?
Right.
And so there was always that back and forth of, okay, let's just look at, this is the amount of interior space you have, the built that we're looking at, and this is the amount of outdoor space you have.
Yeah.
And trying to find that sweet spot of that ratio that's not like a one size fits all, but kind of a guideline, and then also direct connection where you don't have to leave your house and then go to the green space. It's like you step out your back door, you're in your green space.
Absolutely. And in that sense, I would just add that maybe even this, I think the idea of kind of the area it's de-densifying, right? So is there kind of growth in projections of the area? And if there isn't growth, can you do something that Detroit is doing, which is kind of, buying up all this kind of cheap land and kind of turning it into kind of urban agriculture. So there are models that don't depend so much on building or housing kind of as a main dominant program that still kind of satisfy a kind of larger community at an urban scale. I've already talked too much.
Well, on that note, I wouldn't apologize for having buildings. I think that is really a strength of your project. It's similar to the Tbilisi project where you're trying to rebuild a city. You're trying to recreate life in places that have become vacant, abandoned, and bringing green into the city is a tremendous value on so many levels. It improves the environment. It improves people's mental health. I don't imagine that most people that live here are going to be good at producing food, as Ali was saying. I think that the benefit you're bringing to the individual residents and to the neighborhood and to the city is that you're creating more green space for more air and pollution collection and insect support and all these sustainable things. I think that your breaking down of the scale is nice. And Baltimore is row house city. That is the city, and that's the scale is 2 and 3 stories. And as Ali was saying, the stoops, people want that intimate space. They can, it's easy access. So I agree that the larger building is at another level in the public. So I like how you're adding this even smaller row house element of the small houses, because even though there's so much vacancy, I think there's in Baltimore, as there is in Washington, a huge need for affordable housing. So I like having different scales, different entry points for housing. So nice thinking.
Thank you.
James, question for you. Can you tell me or kind of help us understand how the architecture that you've proposed supports the social construct of growing food in a kind of communal nature that would then facilitate the, I guess, solution of the problem of a lack of fresh food in these people's lives?
Sure. So I more or less modeled the placement, the size of this community garden based off of other community gardens in Baltimore specifically. And they're all usually street front. They have high visibility. And so anytime that you're passing through or you're coming home or you're going out, you see the garden. And the most successful community gardens arguably have attached infrastructure. And so the market hall, the community space, all can tie into supporting that garden, storage space, place for tools, places to have teaching sessions where community volunteers or even a private organization can come in and teach people and guide them in the process of growing food. So I guess kind of going back to what was said earlier about this kind of being a nucleus, an example of a nucleus for development through the city is that you can't just provide people with that space to grow. You need to provide them the support to learn how and what they need, and when they run into problems, what they do. Yeah. And so that's kind of why this community garden and market and community center are kind of the anchor of the site. Yeah.
So, I agree with everyone. The drawings are beautiful. I think there's some really nice moments of architecture and design in your proposal. And you've kind of, you really dove into certain pieces of this scheme, which then allow us to give you feedback on that. So I'm going to give you some feedback because you've kind of opened that door. So when you're talking about a large shift in a social construct, especially one as kind of meaningful, important, and sometimes challenging as the one you're proposing, you have to be ready to answer the questions and make sure that your design proposal kind of supports these outcomes. In my experience, when you're saying, okay, we're going to, where there's food insecurity, where there's a lack of fresh food, we're going to provide community gardens or places for people to grow their own food. The major challenge is that people with income insecurity, housing insecurity, that are living on modest means, do not have time to grow their own food. And it's actually quite a challenge to, it can be, it's a pretty intense conversation at those times. And I've been in meetings and discussions with people when people get quite upset. They're just like, are you kidding me? I'm working 2 jobs. I don't have childcare all the time. How could you possibly think that I have time to maintain a garden? So I wanted you to come in and address that in a meaningful way in this project, because that, I think, if you were to bring this to people dealing with those issues, would be the main question they would have. And so I was hopeful and wanting to understand from you a little bit. Maybe it's embedded. I heard you say it in the first couple sentences of your presentation, but I didn't hear it in a meaningful way. Is what is the housing or communal component that supports the ability for people to grow their own food? And there's architectural kind of typologies that are being developed, in the kind of co-housing kind of world where people might be able to share resources. There's systems where people are bringing in, other nonprofits and organizations that have grants to do commercial urban agriculture, and then provide, subsidized systems for people to access that produce. But I think you have a fundamental kind of challenge is how the heck are people going to, grow lettuce and tomatoes and stuff when they're working all the time? So that's one big piece of feedback. So you need to address those social constructs. And then the other piece is that I think the corner has a lot of opportunity, but I think you have a kind of paradox of monumentality and intimacy of the stoop construct that's not being resolved in your proposal. You have a little bit of the intimacy, and then it's kind of backed by this kind of monumental neo kind of like Art Deco kind of urban wall. And I would love to see you address that further to make that feel like an urban condition that people would really want to kind of connect with. It's not that. Yeah, I just think, you needed to, I think you could work on that a little more. Like I'd love to see some views from that street facing back towards the building, because this wall is really bugging me. And I'm kind of curious what's going on here. And then how does that actually relate back to what, this kind of connection is? If you've designed a beautiful building here, but I'm just, this kind of zone of it to me needs some work. And I personally think you could have maybe kind of taken a little smaller chunk of this block and developed it further. And that would have maybe made this stronger. And I guess one last thing, just since I'm on a little bit of a rant, is that be careful with obviously the population that you're working with, those residents, and also the connotation of architecture that you're proposing, because the carriage house also has a kind of colonial, connotation and connection to enslavement. There's also the types of architecture, as someone who works a lot in affordable housing, where people relate to affordable housing in a certain way from an architectural standpoint. They say that looks like affordable housing. So just be careful about what you're proposing, how it connects to people's prototypical understanding of those architectures, and then, what you're putting out there.
Thank you.
This is a thought-provoking thesis. I think we are trained to expand urban areas, but we don't always know how to contract and how to do that systematically and deliberately. And I think this is about timing. I kind of see this as a group of individuals that maybe like New Harmony or something want to live in Baltimore in this area, and they have like minds. And you have given them an opportunity to live in many ways. That to me, I liken to UVA lawn. It's the range. Okay, those are range houses, which I do think solves housing problems. We build houses fairly inexpensively on land that's available, and that's the beauty of Baltimore. It's not expensive to buy that land. But I'm unsure about timing for the multifamily building, whether that is moved up to give the density boost that you need. So somehow, you know, which comes first? And I think you have to figure that out. And maybe you have enough money, or your developer client has enough money to do all of it at once, which would be great, to build the market and build the multifamily and have everybody live there within 4 years or whatever, but you know, probably not. So I think you have to kind of deal with that. But every thesis that I've seen that revitalized Baltimore, I shouldn't say every, deals with putting retail in the middle of blocks, which make no sense to me. I like the idea of living, and that lawn that you've created, I think would be just a wonderful place to be and sit. I think the food desert, the idea of everybody growing their own food. I have a building where they started with herbs on the roof and they discontinued it because nobody had interest. Millennials didn't want to farm. They didn't even want to grow basil. They didn't even want to grow sensimelia, for God's sake. Not even dope. They didn't want to deal. They didn't even want, not even basil. So you have other land, and commercially someone could farm it, right? You could join the co-op, because I'm a member of the New Harmony Co-op, and part of it is your farming that happens in Baltimore. It's got great sun, just like everywhere else. I don't know how good the dirt is, but the sun isn't any different than anywhere. So congratulations. It's a great strategy for redevelopment of an area.
Thank you.
An urban area. Thank you.
I think that there's a lot of nice things about this project. The urban design is interesting in that Baltimore has this terrible, and he didn't go into it in great details. Some of you may know this, but Harlem Park is where they tried to make the interblock parks work. And what happened was they tore the really small, very small row houses out of the middle of the parks, of the blocks, and tried to make them public places. And what happened was the row houses were so big that a family couldn't inhabit one row house. They got divided into apartments. So a mother or a father couldn't see their kid playing in the park and go out the rear door. They had to go out, down and out the front door of the park and around. So people quit sending their kids into those parks. So sociologically, it was a real problem for what was going on up there. What I really like about this is trying to use that sort of fragments of the texture of Baltimore to make something. And I think, you know, in terms of phasing, I counted the small houses. I think there's almost 30. That's a nice building program, right? And you could do that all at once. And I think what the thesis does, which is nice, is it introduces this other type that gives value to the monoculture that's there. One of the problems of Harlem Park is that the row houses varied very little in size. They were 4,000 square feet, and they were too big for a family to inhabit. And so by introducing something much smaller as a starter home or a home with a couple of bedrooms and things, I think you bring something that's more market sized. And by virtue of doing that, you actually add value to the stuff that's there. So that's really good. I would like to see actually a site plan with property lines drawn, because I think getting the garbage out of the back and around the front and stuff would be a challenge. Every time I ask students to draw property lines, smoke starts coming out of their head, you know, somehow, but it is a really important thing to understand here. The green space is clever because it adds value. You know, if you have a house looking onto a little green, and it's small enough that it's manageable by the people. So it's the CPTED, right? It's crime prevention through environmental design. It's small enough that people can see across it and know what's going on in that space there. I think if I had made a section, I might have made a section through the middle of that space rather than through the alley or through the middle of the block to show that. And the last comment I have is, I've been going back and forth about the market and looking at this, right? I think actually I would rather see that building there, which is very beautifully detailed, more as a flexible community building. And the reason why is I think if the market was in the other building, you have a service entrance there and loading there, I think in that building that would make it easier to have food coming in and out than it would be for this building.
Yes.
And I think social programs would be really nice in that building for all sorts of reasons. You know, it just seems, I mean, I wouldn't change a thing about the architecture. I would just say maybe the market goes into the ground floor of the mixed use building because it's easier to service, you know.
Thank you.
I think this is a wildly ambitious project. So, you know, I think when you have a project this large, you did a great job in terms of solving the urban notion. And then you sort of ran around and tried to do all the other things. And I think that that's a tough thing to do. So encourage your professors next time to, you know, let you do the large scale stuff and then begin to focus on one or two things instead of trying to do everything. I think the alley dwellings, so they weren't slums, they were alley dwellings and they were geared toward less endowed people, right? So and they became abandoned and that's why, you know, they wiped them all out. So I think your notion of coming back and putting them in is a really strong one. I do think it's the typology of the buildings and that sort of thing is a little odd for an urban construct. So, you know, it feels like a little village of, you know, single story houses that maybe aren't necessarily appropriate for this kind of compact thing. And by reorienting them so that they're in that same kind of row house typology, probably could have gotten a little bit more density in with that. I find the Fremont edge with the pocket park on the corner, I find that to be a raggedy edge. And, you know, there's not a hold the street attitude. It's a very loose edge. And I don't know if that was intentional or not. And I also find that the kind of step back of the balconies on Fremont and the cross street there is an odd architecture given, you know, your attitude about other building expressions that you've come up with. So, you know, I'd think hard about that when you're doing those kinds of intentional moves. I think it's extremely well drawn. So nice to see a hand-drawn presentation. So mostly hand-drawn. So yeah.
The problem, David, one of the problems with row houses. Yeah, I was gonna just a comment about that. There is zero land value here, zero. So I think his idea of making a modular thing that is very low risk and bringing it in is actually, people won't build row houses here. They're giving away the land, you know, so bringing something in that's really low risk like that is, I think, probably one of the ways you're going to revitalize this.
I think they're low scale oriented in a different direction. Don't try to give them little yards or anything like that necessarily, except front yards, and redevelop that urbanity, stoop-like quality faces the park. And that, you know, those small houses facing the park, that does have that, right? So they have a front door that faces the park. That's pretty valuable.
That's why I'd like to see the section through the street and see what those look like. Yeah.
I wanted to jump in before Julie gets a chance to wrap things up and just say that one of the great things that James brought to this problem, which we know is in a way a kind of unsolvable problem, kind of wicked problem at the end of the day, to which there's probably no ideal solution. But he took every aspect of this problem apart. He really began exploring the urban agriculture component, the small house component, the way in which these things could exist over time, and importantly, something that many architects neglect. James spent a good deal of time teaching himself a vocabulary. I can see myself there. Teaching himself a vocabulary of landscape so that he could consider the building propositions and the landscape simultaneously. And this is something that I really got to say is rare with a lot of thesis students. They become preoccupied with the building at the expense of the bigger idea of the landscape. And I really want to just say it was a joy working with James on this, because the brief occasions I had to sit with him, he was always bringing something exciting to the table to think about the relationship between buildings and landscape. I'll be quiet.
I've been sitting here so captivated by this conversation that I actually forgot I was supposed to say something. So I have nothing prepared. But I just want to thank you for the project, for the semester experience. It's been really a lot of fun to talk to you about these things because I live in Baltimore. So it's an area that I don't know Harlem Park intimately, but I'm familiar with it, and obviously with the city at large. I think I was just figuring out this is the third studio that I've had with you, one as an undergrad, and then 600 and now this. So it's been really interesting seeing you evolve. Although in a way, you just kind of got better at what you were already able to do. I mean, I'm not sure why that is. Everybody's different, but I think one of the things I appreciate the most about your process, I have the sun shining in my face, okay, is that you work back and forth between the digital model and hand drawing. And that is something that we are always, as you know, preaching to our students to do that. And I think you are one of, I'm not going to say few, but probably not enough people who actually do it. And so it's not only the sort of presentation style that you have, but you did a lot of hand drawing, and you showed some. I'm glad you showed some of them in your slides of just like churning through versions of the section of the building. And I agree that I think it still needs to kind of find its own aesthetic. Like, how do you actually do all those setbacks in a context like this and have it look like it's intentional, you know? And I really appreciate your search for all those things and the sort of back and forth. And like you said, what is the sweet spot? And so the conversation we've had today has been really interesting, just the perspective of who really would grow their own food here. And if they're not willing to or able to, certainly, what are the options, you know? So the providing of the land and the sort of phasing of re-inhabiting this block, I think all of that is great food for thought. So as a thesis, it's definitely a thesis in my book, which is the kind of project that you cannot solve in one semester or two. It raises a lot of questions, and it's kind of a marker, a signpost for your own career, whether that be your process of how you work, the things you think about. All of it really kind of goes into the mix, I think. So congratulations, and
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes, thank you all.
Okay, we'll rotate here. And if you're watching Thesis, as a friendly reminder that we can all sit in the first couple rows together. You don't have to sit in the back. You can hear better from the front. Someone's got to have a little fun with it. For the presentation? Yeah, sure. You could just do it up there. Right, let us gather for the last presentation of the morning. If you're a juror, let's gather up front. If you're faculty, staff, student, visitor, join us.
Fabian, is it supposed to switch? On the computer? Okay. Right. So, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jan Konen, and today I would be presenting Banish into Existence. And I want to give a big thanks to Michael Esban and also Michael Marshall and Alex Crows. You guys have been fantastic to me. Thank you, guys. So with that being said, what can happen at the intersection of architecture and agriculture? Architects use plant-based materials in building construction, but few investigate the relationship between the land where the material is produced and the building itself. I propose to study this idea of architecture and agriculture relationship through the design of a hemp brick farm, an experimental carbon negative hemp farm with a public visitor / manufacturing building. I propose architectures that's produced by the very same crops that surrounds it. So as a general context, Prince George County has a population of about 966,000 people, and it's pretty well connected in the East region of Washington, D.C., and also rural and also urban communities. And it's also surrounded by 3 major airports, IDA, DCA, and BWI. And it's pretty well known also for its thriving tourism, with its booming industry in aerospatial and also in industrial industries. So looking at the site at a closer glance, we see that the National Library of Agriculture stands as a landmark and can be seen from Baltimore Avenue and can also be accessed from Baltimore Avenue, 495, and also Rhode Island. Currently, the site sits on 77 acres and it's split into 3 parcels. The first parcel being at 15.5 acres, the second parcel being at 3. The second parcel being at 50 acres, and that's where the project will be located. And the third parcel will be at 11.5 acres. And again, this development would be part of the existing campus, okay? And basically with that, I'm basically trying to create this hub where the public can come and learn about the benefits of hemp and also how it gets processed into fibers and then manufactured into hemp brick that I would get more into details later on. So let's talk about hemp. A quick history. So first hemp originated in Taiwan. Then Taiwanese people influenced the Chinese,
before it migrated around Europe, then flown to North America. And looking at this diagram though, there are a couple of like important dates, like what happened in the 1900s. In the 1600s, that was the first sighting of hemp in the US, and that was brought by the Native American. And then in 1900, marijuana and hemp got banished, and because and also was scheduled as a drug 1. And in the 2018 Farm Bill sort of like lifted this ban on hemp and made it again agricultural commodity. And when I'll be talking about hemp, I'm not talking about marijuana. I know that the two come from the same plant, cannabis, but there are two different species. Hemp has a very low THC and also does not produce any psychoactive properties, and it's mainly used for its agricultural products. And from the seeds to the flower, to the leaves, to the stalk, to the roots, all these elements of the plant can be used into different various products. And when I'm talking about products, I'm talking about the extraction of hemp into oils, or maybe into clothes, or maybe into construction materials. And in the US, the plant can go up to 16 feet, and in Europe, it can go all the way up to 24 feet. And I'm not making that up, it's very true. And also, it's a great carbon sequester. When hemp gets planted into the ground, the deep roots of the plant sort of like help to heal the ground and also stores carbon within the soil. And today, one of the most humans are basically responsible for the high level of carbon footprint. And in order for us to sort of try to mitigate these concerns, we need to think about different avenues. For instance, when we look at concrete, steel, and also aluminum, we see that they account for 23% of annual global emission. And in order to fight that, we could look at avenues like using hemp maybe. And talking about hemp, hemp brick, basically, what is hemp brick? Okay, I'll get to that. But hemp brick can be applied on all the parts of a home, starting from the roof all the way down to the floors. And for the primary construction of this development, I was thinking of using heavy timber and infill it with hemp brick. And for this development, the total construction cost would be about 71 million. And what is hemp brick basically? So hemp brick is basically a mixture of lime binder mixed up with some water, and then a little bit of hemp rod, which is the stalk of the plant, and gives you this pasty form material called hemp brick. Pass that along. And some of the characteristics of hemp brick, it's very energy efficient, it's biodegradable, non-toxic, purifies indoor air, and it's also 100% natural without compromises. And in order to get a 50,000 square foot home, you would need 3 acres of hemp. And these were like my personal trials about casting hemp. And as you can see, the first one was a complete failure, and the second one was a little bit more positive. Let's wait and see where the third one takes us. I've looked at a couple of precedents, and again, since the 2018 Farm Bill, hemp has become again a brand new commodity in the US. So they are not too advanced with that technology. So a lot of these precedents are going to be from out of this country. So starting with the Pierre Chauvet Sports Hall, basically I looked at this precedent to sort of understand how could the structure support the hemp brick, and how would the structure can be exposed with the mixture of hemp brick. Another precedent that I looked at was the Voice of Urban Nature. And this one sort of like gave me the idea about staining the hemp brick into a different color. Because as you see here, over 30s W, they dyed the hemp brick into this pink texture that sort of like was coupled with a removable structure that was painted in black too. And now for the landscape now, I did a couple of studies about Paris Saint-Clair, which gave me this idea about trying to start mixing paths of trees and hemp and trying to experience and see what sorts of promenade this type of mixtures would start giving me, you know. And throughout my various studies, I started mixing different things together and ended up, we'll see where. And in terms of the manufacturing facility, I looked at the natural Poluska that's located in Lithuania. And basically, this precedent helped me to shape my floor plan. Because at first, I had no idea how to go about the manufacturing facility. And I had no idea how big a manufacturing facility could be. So this was pretty helpful to me. So there were 5 stages of growing hemp. So with the first one being the germination, that takes about 1 to 2 weeks. The middle stage being the vegetative stage, that takes 2 to 8 weeks, and ending with the final stage, which is the stage 5, the harvesting part of it. And after it gets harvested, there is another process that happens. Excuse me. So as I mentioned before, the plant can grow up to 16 feet in the US. And once it gets harvested and cut, it gets let into the ground. And that's what we call the wetting process. So during the wetting process, I believe the hemp stays within the ground for about like 2 weeks. So it dries out a little bit before it gets baled out and then transferred into the facility where it gets processed. So I propose to study this idea of architecture and agriculture relationship through the design of a hemp brick farm, an experimental carbon negative hemp farm for public visitor manufactured building. I propose architecture that's produced by the very same crop that surrounds it. So again, I started looking at a couple of like different iterations and mosaics to shape the landscape with hemp. And these were a couple of my iterations. And then what led me to these studies of the models, mixing different sort of like experiences. And looking at the first one, scenario number 1 was basically this dual experience where one would walk and be surrounded by either trees or maybe hemp. The second iteration was more of a gradual experience. As you kept walking down, the plants or the trees kept getting taller and taller. And then for the third scenario, I called it the hub because it sort of like created this hub within the middle. And basically that was like a synthesis of the 2 previous models. And again, using the land as a dual purpose was another idea that we looked at. So basically farming while collecting energy. And that's what we tried to achieve with this development. So a brief development summary. So the building size is about 88,000 square feet with a manufacturing facility that's about 33,000 square feet with offices that sit on 2 floors, about 5,000, with interior and exterior storage space that's around 10,000 square feet with a visitor center at 38,000 square feet and exterior mechanical at 11,000 square feet with 87 parking spaces that are all surrounded by 77 acres of hemp farm. And the total development cost for this project would be about $88 million. So now looking at the site from like a closer angle, these were like the site surroundings. So we have the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center, just like the National Library of Agriculture that surround the site, like I've mentioned before. These were like the circulation framework slash zoning, if you want to call it. So the site is currently surrounded by commercial, industrial, agricultural, and also single-family homes. And it seems to be thriving pretty well. And it's also currently the site falls under ROS zone, which is reserved to open space. But in order for me to build on the site, a zoning amendment was required for me. And that's also would sort of like make the project take a longer time. And in terms of the placement of the project, I looked at a couple of traffic counts and where were the area where traffic was hitting the most. As I can see, it was around Baltimore Avenue, which sort of like influenced the placement of the building. Again, that's a perspective view of the development. And as you see here, you see how the building sort of like helps to shape the landscape with the sawtooth roof and the PV system that got installed on top of it. When you look at the building from a bird's eye view, it seems like the building is seamless within the landscape. And that was the goal. And again, I did know that I didn't mention the program mix before, but this is a more clearer view of where all these elements are located within the structure. And these were like a couple of site strategies that were done. So when you look at the site, you have your combined paths and you also have the human promenade within those two. And now looking at this third diagram, we see what could happen when both of these, when the human get mixed up with the combined harvesters. And in terms of like the social and environmental benefits of this project, what does industrial hemp does for a farmer in general? Basically, he helps to sort of repairs the soil. And in terms of like the carbon impact of this development, the carbon impact would be very low because hemp brick would be made on site. And also with the usage of mass timber, it would help to reduce erosion. So I'll walk you guys through the floor plan right now. And let's say, so starting from the parking area here, as you see in this view, one would progress. And when they come in through the lobby, they would go through this experience. I call it the hemp experience. So one would start at the lobby, and as they would progress down, they would come across different hemp brick elements from basically telling you how the hemp brick was made. And from that point on, as you keep going, you would start seeing actually the presence of hemp within the building. And as you keep going a little bit farther, you see where he gets sort of like dried up and also processed at the end. And when you look to the right, there is this linear experience that's happening as one progresses through this experience. There is a different experience of how it gets manufactured. So in the first area, number 12, that's the decortation area. That's where the hemp gets split into fibers, basically. And after it gets split into fibers, you'll come to the manufacturing area here, where the fibers get processed or manufactured into hemp brick. And after it gets manufactured, you'll get to the storage area where it gets stored. So a visitor would come through this experience, and a truck dropping the herd would be coming through this experience. Again, there is this linear experience for the truck. So they would come in, drop off the bale, and keep going out, and come back on another day and go through the same process, but this time they would pick up the hemp brick and then leave. And once you get to the second floor, you get a catwalk that basically shows you the full experience of the manufacturing facility. And again, this view here shows you that part that I was talking about earlier, how as you keep progressing towards the visitor center, you'll see HAMP that's being grown at different heights. And at one point, you see HAMP getting dried and also how it gets built. And in terms of the development schedule, this project would take about 4 years for construction. And starting with the pre-development to the architectural design and the planning and permitting, that would take you about like 56 months. And then from the construction, another 16. And then after 18 months for the post construction, it would leave the project being stabilized to start and be open by 2028. And now that's a closer view at the manufacturing facility. Again, like I've mentioned earlier, that's the decortation area. We have the manufacturing area here with the catwalk on top. And then in this area, we have the storage. Thank you for your time. And please let me know if you have any questions and would like to invest. Thank you.
All right, I'll start it off, and I'm holding the microphone. Nice project, thank you.
Thank you.
I think it's really important to be investigating these new materials that are involve carbon capture and are renewable and are rejuvenating for the soil. So this is great to see. And I like how you've shown how this product can be used in different applications for the building.
Yeah.
And it's great to see all of your study models.
Thank
They're
you.
beautiful. So one comment on the architecture in this place is that I see these models are showing different densities, different heights, different openness. And I would love to see you, but these are temporal things. These are
Yes.
reflecting the plants growing and
Yeah.
and being rejuvenated. So maybe the design of your facility gives you the opportunity to sort of put these things to make them more permanent by using different heights in your building, different thicknesses to represent this beautiful sculptural models that you've made with the plant material. Maybe that can inform more strongly your building design.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Another thing about talking about efficient and rejuvenating building materials, it's important to consider the entire life cycle of the material.
Yeah.
And so I don't know, is lime a really strong component of this?
Well,
product?
it's not, but like the fact that hemp stores carbon, it sort of like offsets it over time, basically.
Right. So it might be it would be informative to see a comparison of the carbon input into the manufacture of concrete from everything, the heat that goes into it, the mining of it, the transportation. If we could see the same thing with this product, so that can help investors decide if this is, something that is going to be a real benefit.
True.
So life cycle analysis is difficult to do, but I think it's a good data point for looking into the
Awesome.
benefits
Thank
of
you.
these things. So
And
I'm gonna
in terms of the building height, I gave the manufacturing facility the bigger scale because like I thought that, that was the main thing of the project. That's where all the good stuff was happening, so that's why I only sort of like gave some sort of scale and to the manufacturing facility and kept everything else leveled.
Another well-drawn project, very nicely done, presented. What does hemp brick replace? I mean, what does it actually do? So
Any sorts of insulation, I would say.
could you say that louder, please?
Any sort of insulation.
Insulation, so it's
Yes.
an insulation
Yeah,
replacement.
it's insulation replacement. Yeah.
When you were looking at your frames for your sawtooth roof, did you look at prefabrication of those? Did you, how did you consider those?
That did not really go into consideration because I thought about just like having a frame and just using it as an infill instead of actually, shaping the roof like that.
Yeah, it's it's an efficient way to make things. And certainly when you're designing that kind of tectonic structure, it'd be useful to understand the ability to kind of mass produce that, lay it down. But, you know, again, I think your project's pretty well organized. It's very thoughtful, and congratulations.
Thank you.
You know, it was very interesting being part of this journey with you. I didn't know anything about hemp beforehand. And so your reason for looking at hemp, starting with the idea of wanting something to do something with sustainability, but not just what we normally consider sustainability. I've even seen, since meeting you and looking at this, where some of our clients are using hemp instead of the fiberglass insulation. Yeah, insulation. Yeah, which I had never seen.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And so all of that was new to me. And what was, you know, that this is a specialty crop that the USDA is interested in supporting. And even it was a little scary. We had our first meeting here and then driving back to DC. And I'm a little bit of a C-SPAN junkie, but on C-SPAN, they were having an event with the Congress and the USDA, and they were talking about specialty crops and things that can help farmers, you know, sort of transition to things that are more sustainable. And hemp was one of those. So I found the link and made him listen to it. And so, which I'm going to advise you, you know, this is a very thorough project that you should try to get it in front of the very same people that were in that event. And the fact that you use the USDA's headquarters and the association with the University of Maryland and the close proximity, I think that there's something to be had for this. You know, everything that you've learned doing this project and now getting it out in the public realm, I think would be very important because it's a great prototype and a great demonstration center also. So great work. Congratulations.
Thank you.
I'm on the Hempsolation website, and I'm familiar with Hempsolation because a local engineer has kind of brought that to our attention. Architects and others, and the website says there's tax incentives.
Yes.
And rebates. Not a bad thing to have. But why is it better than hay? Or why is it better than other products, and what makes it, I mean, just what makes it so special?
Well,
Does it have to be hemp? Could it be something else?
Well, I wouldn't want to compare the two. You know, I wouldn't want to compare the two. Yeah, I wouldn't want to compare the two. You know, hay is one thing, I think. Cork is another thing. Straw, too. Straw. Oh, straw. I'm sorry. Yeah. I'm not too sure. I did not look too much into straw, but you know, they all fall in under the same umbrella of biogenic materials, you know, so I would assume that they function in the same manner. Yes, there was a performance.
Oh, sure.
I'm trying.
Yeah, and, wonderful representation, thoughtful architecture. I love how you brought there's like a visual thread that continues through your presentation, digitally and printed, which I appreciate. It kind of helps us understand where you're thinking about things, the use of kind of the yellow orange as a key to where you're using hemp in the building. I think that's what that means.
Correct.
So that's very helpful. And so I don't have a lot to say. I think it's a great project, but I just have two little things, you know, to maybe kind of, one is kind of a word of advice going forward is, you know, you spent so much time developing performas and schedules and that kind of thing, and that's great. But I wonder if those resources had been put into a few other parts of the project that you may have been able to develop them a little further, just thinking about your time. And one of them is the spaces that you're creating with the landscape of hemp. I mean, it seems like you started that and talked about the juxtaposition of the, you know, the person moving through the space in relationship to open space or to kind of density of the planted material. I'm talking about this diagram, this diagrammatic model, which is lovely. Thank you for building the model. Also, I crave that in these days. So that and how you're creating a spaces with your landscape, and you called it a mosaic, but because you have so many pathways, I imagine that one, and you're showing people in these renderings kind of moving through them. I'm assuming that you're thinking about those spaces and how they create connections or places of gathering or learning. And I miss that a little bit. I'm like, okay, where is that happening? What are you thinking about with that?
All right. So to start with, as people would be progressing within those mosaics, they would come across like some areas where plants might be taller than others. So that's this visual effect that you get. And then you have hemp prospect mounds. So you have your hemp prospect mound 1 here, and there's the hemp prospect mound 2. And these are raised up about like 9 feet to the ground. And these are areas where people can go and look at the landscape, basically.
Yeah. And that's wonderful. And that's beautiful. And I can maybe garner a little bit of that through those models.
Yeah.
But I wanted you to talk to us about that and tell us about that. To be totally just straightforward, honest, I don't care about the project schedule that much because you're doing research, you're exploring, you're developing your design ideas. And I wanted you to share the thoughtfulness that you put into these kinds of things and the forms that they were being made and how it affects the climate and hydrology of your site. And I wanted, you know, when you present this next, just talk about that kind of stuff.
Gotcha.
And then the other small thing is that, and I think David was picking up on this or starting to, is that in some ways this feels, I think you could turn the dial a little more towards masonry load-bearing construction rather than timber construction, because it's very strong on the timber quality of it. And it almost, if I took away the layer of text about hemp, I would almost think this is kind of like a CLT manufacturing facility, potentially. A little bit of that, right? And I get it that you're trying to create this light frame that then, you know, enables people to have an experience passing through it. And it's about the objects and the hemp experience that
Yes. Yeah, the hemp experience.
right. But I think that kind of exposing the qualities of hemp in a facility like this could be strengthened a little bit. Like, are there other ways when hemp is compressed into heavy fiberboard exterior insulation that is used with CLT quite often? How could you show off some of that? How could you show the cast nature of hemp that you experimented with in a cast form? You know, what about rammed hemp? What about other ways that you could have brought together these kind of tectonic building elements and showed them off in your project? You clearly have the ability to do that type of representation and that thoughtfulness. And that's just, the guidance is just like steer towards the concept and make sure the concept is super strong before worrying about some of the kind of ancillary components to it.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Those are all fantastic comments. I think you have plenty there, but few additional points. When you started talking about the project, I was like, oh my God, he's doing 2 different projects. Like, you know, on one side, the technical kind of aspects of hemp as a building material, right? And on the other side, an entirely kind of urban project of creating this kind of productive landscape, right? That showcases hemp, and it becomes almost a socio-agricultural kind of project, right? But I think you manage really well bringing the 2 sides of the project together. And I think they're actually necessary to one another, right? To understand the value of this massive landscape, which you're kind of carving out of, you said, protective kind of green landscape,
Yes,
right?
yes.
We need to understand the value of it as a building material. We need to understand how it works, right? What are its potential? What are its kind of performative aspects, which I think you could have elaborated a little bit more on. At UVA, we have a couple of faculty that are working heavily on hemp as a building material. And a lot of the research involves looking at hemp as something beyond insulation, right? Because other than that, it becomes monofunctional, right? And it like this entire landscape is for one product, right? And it creates a lot of competition and it loses its kind of socio-ecological kind of value, right? So in that sense, I think the whole landscape as well as the building, which I don't necessarily separate the two, could be geared towards research more than, you know, just a factory with productive landscapes, right? So, and in that sense, as you're researching and as you're opening that research up to the public that surrounds it, you also need to provide for that public, right? Which means that this landscape cannot just be a farm, right? With different kind of patterns of hemp. What do those different patterns of planting provide, you know, in terms of social space? You know, can one be a sitting area? Can one be kind of, you know, kind of a playground, right? Can one be, you know, more educational so people can get their hands dirty, right? When it comes to hemp and all of that. I keep thinking about the Toronto Breakworks. Have you, so that's a really good precedent for you, even though it doesn't actively produce brick.
Yeah.
It reuses kind of a brick making facility into this kind of amazing public educational kind of center that has farmers market and everything like that, while people kind of learning about the brick that was produced there, how it constructed the entire kind of area, urban area surrounding them. So in a sense, I think there could be this kind of programmatic hinge, right, between something that is highly productive, but also something that is highly social as well. And on that note, as I said, I don't necessarily separate the building from the landscape. They're codependent and they could co-evolve, right?
Yes.
And a good question, I mean, a question for me was, what comes first? Right? If hemp is used in the building of the factory or the building, right? Do you start with landscape, right? And over time, the building sort of emerges out of the processes, right? As if it was kind of the hemp was crusting around the processes of its cultivation and its production. Or does the building come first and then the landscape comes second, right? Which kind of changes, you know, your schedules and your kind of funding model and all of that as well.
Lucky for me, I got to experience both. Because I first started with using the landscape to shape the building. And in my opinion, I did not think that was successful in some ways. So that's why I moved more towards doing the building and trying to see how the building could shape the landscape.
Why wasn't it successful?
Because I have no idea what a building might look like within the landscape, if the landscape is there first.
Right.
But in the other way, if I have my building, at least to me, it's easier to shape the landscape within the building.
Right. You're thinking as an architect as opposed to a landscape architect, which makes sense. We'll get into that more. But I think there's value in thinking about that kind of landscape process as well, and how those processes could inform a very specific way of building, which I think you are incorporating. So the rhythms of your columns and the sawtooth, everything kind of goes with the patterns of the plants and the different kind of mosaics, as you call them. But I think there could be a little bit more integrated as a kind of process into one. Otherwise, fantastic work.
Thank you.
I do support the sentiment that this may be more of a panel building than it is sort of a brick building, but you have components of both. I think it can be built now with hemp technology, but it needs an R&D component. And you want to develop that product And this is where that would happen, as well as the growing and the education. You know, it's an education center for the benefits of hemp. That's why I asked why hemp. But if you can, over time, you might add to this building, and that might be added with different products that you've developed in this R&D center. So I didn't see any. There's no laboratory. There's no, center that could be like that. But it would be part of a building like this, I believe.
Gotcha. Well, the thing is that like this project, I don't know if there is like any other project like that exists, because usually you either have a manufacturing facility that's just like extracting hemp into fibers, or you just have the farmers or just growing hemp. You don't have. Yeah, exactly. So.
Yeah, I think also you didn't explain in the beginning. You're a dual major.
Oh yeah, I'm a dual degree.
So that's why there's
That's why
a
I
lot
had
of
to
the
do the
data
performa and
at
like
the
all that
beginning.
good stuff. Yes, I didn't do it on my own time, trust me.
But he's happy that he.
Yeah.
I had a quick question about the agricultural aspect of this. So this might be beyond the scope of it, but so it seems like I like the idea of combining it with the trees that and still it's a monoculture, the planting of the hemp. So I don't know if did you run across anything where people were doing stack planting and lower scale stuff to attract beneficial insects, like what are the pests for, this kind of thing. So is there a way to keep it from becoming our typical industrial agricultural project that we love to do so much? And that is the USDA is included in that, by the way. They're the worst offenders. So that's they would love this as a monoculture. And also like different tree species, which trees, like I'm not sure if you got into that yet.
No, did not get that deep into it. Yeah.
Just really quickly, I mean, it's fun. Again, what I enjoy about strong projects like this is it allows us a space to kind of talk about architecture, right? And I think a little bit going off of what Ali was saying was, I could see you developing different typologies, prototypes, different forms of architecture within this landscape, to use this as a construct to say, okay, these things will be happening, and how do we experiment? Like if you were to take this further, if you continue working on this, how do we experiment with forms that, to a little bit, I think what Julie's saying as well, like utilize, take advantage of the possibilities of hemp, and where does the architecture kind of strengthen those ideas and those technologies? Like if it is masonry or a load bearing system, what about, I could see you designing some beautiful kind of agricultural Quonset hut, masonry arch systems. And then I was just looking up a project to remind myself, there's some in Pakistan, in India, some beautiful examples of bamboo architecture that are happening that are very, very, very low carbon, very grassroots oriented. And the architecture kind of supports that building system in a way, using tensile systems, creating, well ventilated buildings that have, a lot of kind of lattice work involved in them. Yeah. And so I'm wondering again, just like, what are the types of architecture that hemp can generate? And then how do you disperse those maybe on the site in a way where you're doing research and building forms and creating structures that support that as a kind of experimental facility? And I think that might like kind of clear off the idea of the large kind of industrial kind of experience that's created with this large, plane of hemp. Just as a fun way to think about next steps.
Thank you.
Yeah, and this is a really beautifully drawn and presented project. And so one of the things I want to commend you on, in addition to the presentation, is the models. I count at least maybe 9 models, and then the samples of the actual materials that you made. And the drawings are beautiful as well. So any my next comments are just kind of constructive. And I would reinforce the comments from our colleague from UVA and Julie just now about kind of the relationship between the building or the factory and the landscape, and reinforce all those comments, but also kind of talk a little bit about the way it's drawn, especially in your big site plan, because until I started to look more closely at the beautiful aerial perspectives, it was hard to read. Is that landscape? Is that machine? And so not only kind of the way it's designed, but how it's represented, I think could help answer some of the questions that were raised. And then similar to James' project, you guys both have these really long, beautiful sections, and they're both transverse or longitudinal, and I want to see the transverse one. I want to see the one that goes through the sawtooth so that we understand how that light can flood into the into the shop floor, and then at the kind of the scale of the detail, again, until you answered some of the questions, I was trying to figure out, okay, is it actual brick? Is it load bearing? And so maybe there's a nomenclature thing there. And if it's insulation, I guess the yellow on the long drawing shows where it's used behind those walls. So my question is kind of at the level of the detail where you can touch the stuff, like the way you passed it around. Is that covered up with drywall or
No, it's
board,
exposed.
or is it exposed?
Yes, it's exposed.
So you need, somewhere like a large scale wall section, half scale with a full scale figure showing how that wall is bumpy. And, if you brush up against it, it's going to flake off. What the tactile experience is at the scale of the body, I think could help. And then don't forget about lateral bracing. We need some lateral bracing in here.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Very briefly, Jan, it's having had you in studio in another life and in Thesis, it's terrific to see this project come to fruition. I hope that's not a bad pun. I think the comments that you've gotten about the connection of landscape and the organics are all very much on the mark. Your graphics, and I don't use this word very often, but I think the drawing is exquisite. I would quibble with you in one small way, though. I would have let your perspectives occupy the top of your board and put that timeline below it. But anyway, so the final perspective there, the aerial, I think is a vehicle for this investigation, this exploration of the relationship of landscape to your building, the syntax of your building, the tectonics of it. And I would agree that there's something I think that you could develop in terms of the convergence of the organic system and the tectonic system that you're developing within the building. And so that brings me to your perspectives. And I was struggling a little bit to get oriented because they are sequential, but they're not all looking in the same direction, right? But they're on what we would call in England the mall, or the mall, as Norman Foster referred to it, which is your linear space. So we're walking sequentially, correct?
Correct.
Into the space. Okay.
Correct.
So here's the perspective that I think you might be missing. And the good news is that you could, you're very capable. You could produce this. I think it's the perspective from within the organics that looks at your building. Because the wonderful thing about your project is that you've done all this very detailed research and you're very serious about the tectonics, but you also talked about the experiential, the hemp growing and making these spaces within the hemp. And so I would love to see a perspective that gives us a sense of the experience within the hemp as it sets up the sequence within the building. But congratulations. Wonderful to see it.
Thank you.
Jan, congratulations. I think you did a great job. I just want to reiterate the fact that you are a dual degree student with the Master of Real Estate Development. And my experience has been with dual degree students that it's always a delicate balance, balancing the real estate development aspects with the architecture aspects. You did your capstone presentation very well on Saturday. And I'm sure that there were developers there that said you focused too much on the architecture side of the slate.
Yes, they
So
did.
it's almost a no-win situation for dual degree students.
Exactly how I felt.
But I think that you were able to balance it in a very good way. And I got to tell you, when you came to us last year with this idea, there was a healthy amount of skepticism. And we struggled with how you would pay for it, and which is, the developers always say, if you can't pay for it, then it's not realistic, right? You can't get it done. But we worked with you over the course of the semester and last semester, and we were able to come up with a financial model that worked. You did the market analysis, the construction schedule, the environmental and the social benefits. All of these things are important to a project. And so I'm so glad that you were able to work through this and evolve into a project that is realistic. And I think that you should continue to pursue it. I think that it has a lot of merits. And I think the federal government really would be interested in this product and how they can use it in a sustainable way for projects in the future. So thanks a lot for all of your work and you're being adamant about doing this.
Thank you. Yeah.
Marie, you just read my mind. I was going to ask him about how economically it was justified, to have this project in such an expensive site in DC area, with an expensive kind of labor, but you answered that he did the job. And so, yeah, no reason to justify that.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Great. Good. So Jan, thank you so much. I really appreciate that you asked me to join you on this journey. And it's hilarious to hear from Maria that when you brought the idea to real estate, there was skepticism. When you brought it to me, I was like, right on. But I think the question that you're asking, like what can happen at the intersection of architecture and agriculture? That's a perennial question, right? That's been with us for a long time, and we've seen so many different answers to it. And I have really enjoyed the kind of lively conversation about what these professionals think it can be as well, right? You brought your idea about what can happen at that intersection, and here we hear academics and professionals riffing on this and showing us more dimensions and more ideas, right? So what I appreciate about it's not often that we see the notion that the building itself is constructed of the crop of the landscape, right? And the two are so intimately conjoined, right? So I think you're bringing that kind of that lens, that question of that conjoining, but also the contemporary lens of embodied carbon and our needed care around that question as well, right? So this has been really fun to work with you on this. It's maybe the third project you and I have engaged in. There's been studios, there's been other kind of research projects, right?
Yep.
Jan was my GA in site analysis. So it's really always been a pleasure to work with you. You're very professional, very diligent, always enthusiasm's always through the roof. So thank you. I'm really proud of you.
Thank you, Michael.
And that concludes our morning presentations. We'll be back here at 2 p.m. So thesis students, please pin down so others can pin up, and then faculty and jury will head upstairs and then come back down again at 2. Thanks.